Good morning. My name is Jim Harper. I'm with the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems here at the University of Florida. And we're proud today to co-host today's One Health International Symposium on Risk Communication in Resource-Limited Countries. Today's co-organizers, along with us, are the One Health Center of Excellence, the Center for Stress-Resilient Agriculture, and the Center for African Studies. And you'll be meeting people from all of those centers, and you're going to be impressed, trust me. We're glad that you're here this morning and ready to talk about this. Yeah, corn, peanuts, and other things related to that. So if I accidentally drop the corn, it means something has gone wrong and we're going to have to stop and start over, okay? So let's not do that. Let's not get too corny here. All right, so we're going to start off with three speakers, and they're going to briefly introduce you to their centers and their work. And then I just want to quickly mention the schedule for the rest of the day so that everyone's on the same page. You probably have one of these schedules, or you can share one with your neighbor. So this first session is about the current situation that we're dealing with, and you're going to learn more about the topic as we go on. We have a coffee break, and then session 2 is challenges and opportunities, starting at 10:20. Then we break for lunch at 12:10. I'm sorry, I skipped over session 3, the panel discussion, very important, at 11:10. And then we have lunch. And then after lunch is the fourth session, which is a special communications workshop, starting at 1:10. And then most of you will be done at 2:40 today, if you stay for the whole event. There is a follow-up brainstorming session at 2:50, a coffee hour, for those of you who know about that already. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. We're going to have some introductions and welcomes before we get on to some of the more in-depth presentations. So we're going to hear from Ilaria Capua first, if I could ask her to step forward. And then we're going to hear from Brenda Chafflin and Saskia Hendricks as well.
Good morning. Thank you and welcome to this meeting, which is really about working together. This is another video which wasn't planned. Okay, good. So yeah, this is what happens when you project videos. Sometimes things go wrong. But the message of this video is really what I wanted to talk to you about this morning. UF has enormous potential. It has fantastic scientists that are working in their own little silo and that are generating wonderful data that could be used to progress the advancement of science. What we are trying to do at the One Health Center, and we are trying to do with many other centers around here, like the Center for Stress-Resilient Agriculture, like the PI Center, like the Center for African Studies, like other groups of people, the Livestock Innovation Lab, and on and on and on. We want to make science a bit more than what it is. We want to make science into something we can use, and we want to make science something which can be used in practice, even in countries that are very far away from where we are just now. And so this is a very important meeting for us because the One Health Center has been trying to get people together around the same table to discuss issues to which each one of us can contribute. And the Livestock Innovation Lab and the Feed the Future initiative has given us this opportunity. And so thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for making this happen. And let me leave the floor to Brenda Chafflin, who is the director of the Center for African Studies, with which our center is working very, very closely. Thank you, and remember that together science can. Wake up. This is our chance to show us that together science can. Thank you. Brenda, please.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to see you all here. I'm Brenda Chalfin. I'm the director of the Center for African Studies at UF. And just to second Ilaria's message, this really is all about partnerships. And what is so gratifying and exciting for me to see is the kind of partnerships the Innovation Lab and Feed the Future and One Health have really made happen on campus and across the African continent with all of the countries and the country-based scholars and institutions and communities with which you are involved. And this is just the sort of effort that the Center for African Studies really would like to endorse and enable and to help you build upon. The Center for African Studies is in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. While we are in that college, we are of the university as a whole. And our mission, our goal is to support and work with scholars and students and departments across the university. And one of the initiatives that we have through our U.S. Department of Education grant, which is the major source of funding for the center, is to catalyze the kinds of endeavors around health in Africa, technology and science in Africa. And the program today and the kind of work that you do through the Innovation Lab really is a leading edge of that. So I'm just going to say a couple of things about the center because I want to remind you what we have to offer you. You might think of us, oh, well, you are the place where people study African literature or you're supporting community outreach events. I want to let you know that we have a lot of resources and support that can be of assistance in different kinds of scientific research regarding Africa. Our center has MOUs with about 25 different African universities. If you are thinking about working on the continent and you're looking for partners, feel free to come to us because we could link you up. We also have the kinds of scholarly resources and expertise that if you're sending a team or you're considering a visit to a particular country, come to us. We actually can help organize a briefing, a background on history, politics, and culture, even if it's just a couple of hours to get together so you feel that you and your students and your colleagues are really well informed. The other thing that we can do is provide language tutorials. We have money in our grant just for this sort of thing. Whether a group is going to go to Niger or Ethiopia and you just want a little bit of language background, whether it's 2 hours or 10 hours or maybe a whole semester, we offer Amharic, we offer Swahili, Akan, Zulu, Yoruba, and Wolof every single semester at multiple levels. Whatever African language you might need, come to us and we can just enable your researchers to have a little bit of that foundation. And the other thing we can help you with is just publicizing your programs. We have a website, we attend a lot of conferences, we have a yearly research report, and we'd be very happy to feature your events, your endeavors, your findings. And finally, we, like you, are very dedicated to UF's mission on many levels. And that includes a very foundational mission regarding undergrads. And one of the initiatives that we are really trying to build on is to create more opportunities for undergraduates to go abroad. So if you have opportunities for undergrads to work in your lab, to assist you with library research, to assist you in the field, please come and see us and we can help find the students who really can be the next generation to move the kinds of questions and efforts and global solutions forward. So once again, Thanks for being here today and bringing your time and your knowledge, and keep the Center for African Studies in mind. If you want to sign up for our mailing list, we have a weekly bulletin. We have another sign-up sheet outside, and there's some info on the center there. Have a great day at the conference.
Good morning. My name is Saskia Hendricks, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems. On behalf of our team, I would really welcome you today to this exciting event. First, as Hilaria said, it's the first time that we really pulled together and organized something in this way. And well, let's see how it goes. Let's not go ahead, run ahead of the facts, but we hope. And I think at least we can hope, we can always be hopeful, that more events of this will follow with colleagues across campus, really, as Hilaria said, tapping into the expertise here at UF, and also with real, addressing real world problems with the expertise here at UF. So without further ado, I would really like to start the program now. So I hand over to Jim, our Master of Ceremonies today. Thank you, Jim, and enjoy it today. Thank you.
And thank you to my supervisor, Saskia. So we work together at the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems, and I encourage you to please pick up a brochure on your way in or out to learn more about us. But I want to say that all of you are stakeholders. You're all involved as taxpayers, because this was created with taxpayer funding, and it's part of the Feed the Future initiative across the federal government to address hunger and food insecurity. So please learn about this, because you paid for it, okay? And it's here at UF. You should be proud of it. All right, so I'm going to pull up this presentation for our next speaker. And you'll see we have a very international crowd today, which is great, because we're dealing with an international issue. Nicolas Fernandez Gallo is a scholar at the One Health Center of Excellence here at UF. And he's also from the Universidad Nacional de Colombia. And he's here today to set the stage. What are aflatoxins, and why do they matter? Nicolas.
Thank you. Good morning again. I am Nicolas Fernandez Gallo. I come from Colombia. I'm here doing an internship in the One Health Center of Excellence here in UF. So I'm right here today to start this symposium, setting the scene with problems related to aflatoxins. Why do they concern us? How much impact can they have? It is something global and generalized, or something specific and punctual? Well, the first things that I found was this 1989 article from the New York Times. And as you can see, it refers to a kind of poison in the corn. And that poison mentioned were the aflatoxins. In short, whoever reads this article may think, if I eat this, I die. But let's also refer to the concrete facts about everything that surrounds the aflatoxins. First, staple crops are important around the world. But sometimes certain kinds of fungus can grow on, and they produce toxic compounds. And in that case, then they can cause health problems in humans and animals, but only in that case. Not always. You can eat maize and you won't die. So here we have some examples of foods that can be contaminated with aflatoxins. Some, we will find them in their natural state, like peanuts, coconuts, some seeds like cotton seeds, sunflower seeds, rice, corn, oats, milk, eggs, and others may already be processed, like cooking oils, breweries, chocolate bars, or dairy products as well. So how can aflatoxins contaminate staple crops? Well, we have two problems here, heat and humidity. And these problems may be present in the pre-harvest activity, like growing the crops because of field fungi, or in the post-harvest activities, storage, processing, distribution, consumption, because of the storage fungi. What are the possible effects of consuming foods contaminated with aflatoxins? Well, we have two problems here. Health problems, because aflatoxins are poisonous. They may produce liver cancer. That's a principal concern. They may suppress immunity, especially in children. Or they may impair growth in children. And by the other hand, aflatoxins are harmful to economies. So they spend or they cost a decline in production capacity of livestock, and then lower yield for the producers, or probably the cost of management, like a regulatory effort for the surveillance or any enforcement related with. What is the problem that concerns us the most with the aflatoxins? Well, the problem is the human consumption. And it could be a direct consumption of contaminated foods, or indirect consumption through livestock products. And this indirect consumption is because of livestock fed on contaminated feed. And the problem with this indirect consumption is, most of the time, it's an invisible hazard. We can see the aflatoxin in milk or eggs. Where are the aflatoxins? How relevant is their presence? How big is their problem? Well, that's what we want to know. What I want to show you with this map is there is a diverse panorama regarding aflatoxins. So some countries are apparently doing things well. Those countries in green. In other cases, the situation is worrisome. Countries in red. For others, they may be realizing the magnitude of this problem. Countries in yellow. But many countries do not even know what the situation is. It's those countries in white. So this is a last year map which reveals the worldwide prevalence for aflatoxins in feedstuffs, 2017. And the biggest concern with this map is the huge white wave that we can see. So these countries in white means no data, probably not surveillance, probably a few studies, probably no communications. So that's the biggest concern. So then aflatoxins affect the entire food system. And the food system is not a simple system, as you can see. So that's why we need to address the problem holistically. How? With actions that offer solutions in social, farming, economic, and environmental as well. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for your time.
So welcome back to the One Health International Symposium on Risk Communication in Resource-Limited Countries. We have some great speakers for you now, as well as a panel before lunch. So I think you're going to enjoy that. And what we'll do is we'll have all questions taken during that panel session. So if you have questions for the next two speakers, you can ask it at that time. So right now, I'd like to welcome Dr. Renata Serra, who's a senior lecturer in the Center for African Studies and also a faculty expert with the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems.
Hello, is it good? Yeah. Thank you, Jim. So I'm a development economist by training and work for the Livestock Innovation Lab. And as part of the lab, I'm learning so many new things from science and especially related to livestock. And of course, aflatoxin has emerged as a really interesting topical discussion. And I really confess I knew nothing of it before engaging in this conversation and preparing for this talk and hearing from my colleagues. And so I'd like to bring the perspective of a development economist interested in agriculture. I'm really interested in agricultural policies, livestock policies, but also from the point of view of a social scientist, interested in the cultural context where policies are supposed to be implemented. I'd like to recognize the help of two research assistants, Karen Coker and Rio Trimono, who put together some evidence, and we are still working on it, on the evidence of the prevalence and responses in East and West Africa. These are the two main regions from which our countries are from in the African continent. And so, but I'd like to necessarily not to focus too much on the findings, because I think the previous speaker, and Bolen particularly, has mentioned that the prevalence of aflatoxin in food and feed is very wide. I'm going just to share a very summary and not complete findings from published research on some countries in West Africa and then in East Africa. And what I want to convey is that there are several studies that look at the prevalence of aflatoxin in food and feed, and they all find alarming high levels. Nicolas presented a table, a map, where the few African countries from which we have evidence were mainly in red, which means high prevalence of aflatoxin. So even just going very quickly through these two tables, you see that the rates of prevalence are very high, and also in East Africa. Here, findings are mainly from Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, but there are also studies in Ethiopia. It has been mentioned that aflatoxin has important health and economic consequences. Looking at the health consequences, I'd like to mention that it's one of the major toxins responsible for liver cancer, but the important thing is that it has synergistic effect with the Hepatitis B virus, which is unevenly spread throughout the world, and I'll come back to this point later. But as Bola mentioned, it has important negative effect on children's development, because it acts negatively on child stunting, and it's a compounding factor in resistance to antibiotics, which is also important when it comes to child development. I think it was mentioned that there are important negative effect of aflatoxin, prevalence on trade. So I'd like to just give you some sense of the negative effects. Aflatoxic contamination is #1 cause of EU rejection of agricultural goods. West Africa and East African countries export mainly to, among the OECD world, mainly to European markets. And this is where the aflatoxin standards are the most stringent. I'll come back to this, much more than in the US. There have been various studies. Some of them project the yearly losses from missed or lost trade from aflatoxin contamination to be between $2/3 of $1 million a year to, $2/3 of $1 billion to 1.2 billion a year, depending on which groups of commodities you include. So if it's only cereals, nuts, dried fruit, or all commodities together. Nigeria is highly affected from what we know from the sparse data we have, and also a large exporter to the EU. And only when it comes to Nigeria, we have that 30% of agricultural commodities from Nigeria were rejected by the EU on this account only. WFP, the World Food Programme, rejected 2 tons of maize from Burkina Faso, again due to this contamination. And just one estimate from another country that we work in is that the total annual loss to missed trade, to lost trade, is about $38 million. So the estimates are again sparse from some countries and some group of commodities and not others. But overall, they give you the picture that there are losses to African countries due to both health and lost trade, and therefore repercussion on the economic well-being of not only whole countries in terms of lost economic growth, but also to the well-being of farmers, smallholders, and their families. And so there are certainly benefits to be gained from addressing this problem, and these are, again, health benefits, economic and trade benefits, and food security benefits, right? That's why we are here, because we know that the challenges are, high. The consequences of not acting are very high, and the benefits from appropriate interventions are also high. I'd like to just speak a bit about standards. I was reading about the standards and their effects on trade. Now, these standards, as I was saying, are different in all parts across various countries. Standards are good. They promote safe food. The idea is that if a food item doesn't meet certain health and hygiene standards, is not going to enter into a countries that promote these standards, and also promote trade, because if African countries manage to meet certain standards, for instance, from the European Union, they can actually export those goods into the European Union. The East African community, among other regions in Africa, had tried to adopt some standards precisely to help their economies and farmers and producers to have a recognized quality of food and be able to export. However, these standards are different even between the few countries that are part of the EAC. Kenya, Uganda, that's supposed to be Tanzania, and Rwanda have just few standards recently that all mention the main toxin of aflatoxin groups. However, they are, as we will see later, they are loosely implemented. But there has been this effort to come up with standards that are, most of them, in between those determined by European Union and the US. There are various reasons for law enforcement from the Eastern African communities, countries, which are the institutional and lack of capacity of government agencies that are supposed to enforce these standards. There are different roles that various agents have, sometimes overlapping. There's a limited coordinations, limited resources to enforce them. And this has taken has resulted in frequent evasion of regulation and emergence of parallel informal markets where food that doesn't meet standards are indeed traded. So the problem with lack of enforcement is that food that doesn't meet standards may not find its way into the European Union market or in other high-income countries, but is not excluded from trade, is actually going to be traded internally in those countries where the problem exists. And so we have a paradox somehow, which is that standards are unevenly distributed across the world, but so are the conditions for their implementations and also some underlying health conditions that compound with aflatoxin contamination. So if we look at these very simple 2x2 tables, we have the standards in rich countries are stringent, they're enforceable, and they have high capacity to keep this enforcement. In poor countries, there are fewer standards. Some countries don't have them at all. Some countries, as I mentioned, like in East Africa, they have few. They're hard to enforce because they have low capacity to enforce them. There's also a reality which, again, I'm not an expert on, and I like to hear from health experts here, but the prevalence of the hepatitis B virus seems to be much higher in poor countries than in high-income countries, which means that, on the one hand, poor countries produce highly contaminated food that they cannot export. They therefore consume it more likely internally and have conditions health-wise for a compounded negative effect of the toxin itself. And so you have this kind of asymmetry due to the the uneven distribution of standards, which whereby the standards developed by high-income countries lead in high-income countries to health gains and economic protection. There's a whole literature that also looks at, in general, phytosanitary conditions and health hygiene standards as non-tariff trade barriers. In low-income countries, however, there are health losses because all the food that is contaminated is actually consumed internally, economic losses from the inability to export and trade. So this is one set of reflections that I think are important to consider when we think of standards which ultimately we want to implement, because the question is, does this mean the standards are of no use? Clearly, the answer is no. Standards are important and ultimately the way to go. However, some literature, including Dalia Grace, who is one of our partners and collaborator, has done a lot of research on standards. And one of her arguments is that in some conditions, they may be of not much use or even counterproductive. So when we think of implementation of standards, we have to think of the wider context for enforcement and look at the right dose and timing. And so a lot of literature, therefore, looks at other interventions that look at the problem in a more holistic way. So a lot of questions were asked about how to address the problem of aflatoxin. Do you intervene at the level of the crop growth or afterwards? Can you do something with the food that is already contaminated? And indeed, there is series, as some of the speakers before me told all of you, there are a series of interventions that can be implemented at all levels, all stages of the value chains. They're a way to classify them that is useful, and they consider 4 categories. 2 of them are at the agricultural stage, so pre-harvest and post-harvest interventions. Some of them have been mentioned, like the biocontrols and the good agricultural practices, which is suitable fertilization and suitable use of cultivars. Post-harvest, As I think one of the graph in the first presentation was showing, there's a lot of stages in which fungi can actually develop, especially in condition of heat and humidity, and therefore cleaning, sorting, and segregation, improved storage, and other treatments like ammoniation and chemical control can help on those phases. When, however, the food reaches the market, then there are other solutions. This is more down the value chain. Some of them are at the dietary level, and we talked, I think some people talked about enterosorbents and chemopreventive agents, but there's also one that is not mentioned here, which is a switch in diets. So in some cases, for instance, a switch away from crops that are very susceptible to aflatoxin to those that are less may be useful. But it may not be useful for others. In the case of milk and dairy products, for instance, in the Livestock Innovation Lab, we are working for the increased consumption. There's not really substitute for milk, although here in this market we have all kinds of milk that are not from animal sources. But in our context, we want to promote the real milk. So switching to other diets to other food is not always a feasible solution. And then the last is a clinical interventions, which is Hpv vaccination. So the hepatitis B virus increases the risk of developing liver cancer following the consumption of aflatoxin contaminated food by 30 times. So, which means in a population with very low prevalence, or low susceptibility to the hepatitis B virus, you have an incidence of disease from aflatoxins is much reduced. So that is also a possibility. But again, not very feasible in developing countries where vaccination, even for the most basic diseases, are difficult to achieve on a larger scale. So the question of I think this is a very interesting list of possible solutions, and scientists are really working on understanding the efficacy of these solutions. But the social scientists always ask, which ones are more feasible? Which ones are more likely to be adopted? And so we have to go beyond the technical efficacy and also the cost effectiveness, and I come to this later, but look at the broader context. And I borrowed this from Felicia Wu's work, which I think expressed very well how the questions around the feasibility of the intervention should look at a spectrum of factors around that. And they go from government capacity to usage characteristics to delivery characteristics and intervention characteristics. So this is just a framework, and she uses it to understand the feasibility of two of the most popular intervention against aflatoxin. And one that I took and I wanted to share with you is the one of biocontrol, because it is a solution that in African context is much sought after. And AflaSafe is the prototype of this solution, which, for instance, has been piloted in Burkina Faso, among other countries. Biocontrols, as Bola said, are so biological pesticides. There are strains of fungi that are non-toxic, that are implanted or put in the soil to grow and to push away the toxic fungi. And they are feasible for many crops, including maize and groundnuts, which are the most susceptible to aflatoxin. What does the science tell us about this? There are several studies that show the efficacy is high. So a lot of scientists started to say how good it is to push out the aflatoxin that is toxic, and deleterious to health. And few of the studies say that between 50%, there is between 50 and 90% reduction of aflatoxin. So that is really good news. then fewer studies have analyzed the cost effectiveness. Okay, this is a very good solution, but how much does it cost compared to the benefits? And this is, again, Felicia Wu and her co-authors, they looked at this effectiveness, and they find that as of WHO standard, it's the highest category of effectiveness, which is very effective in terms of health prevention, liver cancer prevention. If it's very effective with respect to one particular problem, it's even more effective if one considers that there are other negative implications from aflatoxin. And the other level is to consider, okay, now it's cost effective, but what is the technical feasibility of this intervention? And again, Felicia Wu studied this in the context of a particular West African context, and found that in some contexts, especially when farmers get already input from extension system and the extension system are able to deliver those, the biocontrols can be delivered in the same way, can be applied by farmers as they do apply the fertilizer and pesticides, and so it's something that is feasible and not so costly for an extension system to put in place. However, the question is what happens in other contexts where farmers do not get extension services, do not get already a package of fertilizer and input. And clearly these are questions that we need to address with further research. What would it take to make this technically feasible in other contexts in which we work? And then there is a wider question, which I think is also not widely yet addressed, of institutional sustainability in the long term. A lot of these projects start as pilot projects from donors. Typically, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, IITA, and other organizations have been behind these very successful pilots. What happens when these projects finish and then this has to be taken over by the state or the private sectors? Who is going to put in the finances or the institutional capacity? So I think we are really early on in this process, in the right direction, I would say, but early on. And what is true of biocontrols, that are probably among the interventions with fewer technical constraints and wider positive effects, maybe need also to be assessed for other kind of interventions. My sense is that as we go down the value chains, things become more difficult. So biocontrols, you remember, are at the first, the pre-harvest chain of interventions. It could be that as we go along, the problem becomes so widespread. And there's also another hidden problem. In developed countries, it was referred, I think, by someone before, when a food is considered contaminated, is actually put away, dispensed of, taken away from the food chain. What happens in many African contexts is that it can find its way among a lower level of consumers. So although protected consumers in the formal market may be safe, actually a lot of people who access food through informal markets may get around eating this food. So the idea would be to do as much as possible at the pre-harvest phase or post-harvest before the sort of inclusion of food in the market. I think I should conclude. I just wanted to just provide some points of reflection for the subsequent discussion on risk communication. Why the question of why some governments act and some others don't, or stakeholders. And I think it's important to ask the right questions. Sometimes we think of lack of awareness as the main problem, and in some cases it's proven to be the case. But what about if it's not just lack of awareness? It's actually, I think a lot of stakeholders in Africa know the problem. There have been, because of the interventions before, PACA has organized many workshops. Clearly, we need to organize more, but a many sensitization campaign among the government agencies and stakeholders. I'm not saying about the farmers, where lack of awareness is very low, but a lot of people in some of these governments know. So under what conditions would they implement this intervention? And maybe, yeah, so sometimes the awareness of costs and benefits is important, so that if we know that the benefits from action are greater than the costs, we would, intervene. And this is what a lot of sensitization workshops are meant to do, to convince governments and actors that there are benefits from doing something. But also there are risk perception that sometimes we don't take into account, and these are really subjective, and they are context dependent. And I hope we can go back to that when we discuss in the panel of how this perception different in different contexts, especially when governance in different countries is different, where there's more free press or less of a free press, as we have in Africa, quite a variety of these conditions. And also the third is feasibility of solutions. I had a lot of interactions with bureaucrats in agricultural ministries and so forth regarding other problems, and sometimes they are totally aware of the issues, but they don't have the means to address them, and so they act as if they don't know it, because being powerless is incredibly humbling and not a good position to be in. And when I say powerless, is financial and institutional-wise. And so the risk perception also by farmers can be deemed or dampened if they are poor and they have no other choices, if the time horizons is really short. So a lot of research shows that people and poor people in stressful situation, they don't appreciate risk, or they just have no choice. And so they act as if they didn't know the risk. And if there are other competing risk factors, like they eat a food or they die, and this happened in the acute aflatoxicosis incidents in Kenya a few years ago, where maize was contaminated, but there was so much food insecurity that a lot of people used and consumed that maize. They might have known of the contamination or not. This might not have had an effect on the prevalence of diseases derived from that. And also governments. There's also competition from other policy priorities, maybe lack of availability of solutions that really dampen somehow the response. So really the final reflections are who benefits from information about food safety. Often in developed countries are the more urban, educated people that would benefit. Probably the poor, illiterate people who cannot even access media would never benefit. Should information about risk be released at once to all or filtered to actors according to their potential to intervene? I mean, this is a tough question and very provocative, but I like to put it out there. And what are the best ways of communication to and engagement of relevant stakeholders? And I really agree with Bola that we need to engage with not only traditional media, but also the social media and all kinds of communications to reach out to the largest number of possible people. And with that, I think I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Renata. She'll be available for questions after this next talk, as will many other panelists. And so let me see, let's make sure we've got this presentation ready to go. Yes, we do. And so I'd like to welcome Zach Brim. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Agronomy at the IFAS Tropical Research and Education Center in Homestead, which is south of Miami, and they grow the best mangoes there. So just, FYI, I don't know about the corn, but mangoes are excellent. And he's going to talk about research and extension. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I think I'm going to just make a brief change to my presentation. Let's see, can you all see what I'm doing? No, that works out nicely. Okay. So it'll still be a joke. Okay. All right, so we were talking about social media earlier, and I just want to give you access to my Twitter handle here, @ZachBrim. Did I spell it right? I think so. Okay. So yeah, you're all welcome to sort of continue this conversation there. I absolutely agree that making sure our communication strategies are effective and sort of out there in a really honest and transparent manner. Some of that I'll be talking about today, but certainly we'll move forward into our conversation and panel discussion with what's left of the hour a little bit later on. So I also come to you with a little bit of a balancing act. I've been sort of tasked with being the sort of the out-of-the-box thinker, the guy who's going to sort of take these ideas and expand them into a general framework. But then I also represent the Department of Agronomy, and so sort of the way that I'm thinking about aflatoxin is somewhat specific in that I'm and my research is interested more at that farming level, the production and post-harvest. So what do we think about when we think about agriculture in Florida? These are some examples of sugar and cabbage. Of course, there's no snow in Florida, but I come from some work in Utah on the apples, and so I just like to toss that in there. But the commercial agriculture really focuses on a particular aspect of farming, and that's, of course, the production. We have these systems designed to do essentially one thing very well, and that's to make a single crop, those monocultures that are ultimately efficient in doing what they ought to do. When you add in the agricultural technology, then you really start adding up to the revolution of agricultural technology and techniques, all from the breeding to the engineering. These sort of developed countries in production agriculture are able to take these technologies and really push our fields and our production to what consider the sort of optimal yield. Now, I also think about a lot of other things, and this is sort of my contribution to the agronomy department. It's not just about production agriculture, it's about agriculture and all these other things. Agriculture and the surrounding land around agricultural fields. The diversity of agriculture across the region. So this picture here is the cropscape layer from the National Ag Statistics Service, and each of those different colors is a different agricultural system. Now, we can sort of have a conversation about how accurate I think this cropscape layer is for South Florida, but suffice to say that there's a lot of different things going on, not only the crops, but the Everglades that are over here in the blue, and the Miami metro area, which is in the gray. And so it's agriculture and all of these other things going on as well. And of course, the thing that separates agriculture from natural areas is that there's all these people, the people that are interacting. Of course, these are just pictures of me and my family, but you can imagine what all the other families look like. And this is some of the crux of what we've been talking about today, that it's not just about producing food, but it's about how we get these food to the people, what quality of food it is as we move through the system. And of course, people are the ones doing the work also. They're the ones preparing the food and producing the food and all that. So agriculture is all of these things, and and we have to truly understand the system of agriculture in a meaningful way in order to make differences. We can, as been said a couple times, we can sort of silo our thinking and really focus in on a narrow part of the food system, but ultimately for us to have a productive conversation today, we've got to do all of these things successfully. We've really got to take a transdisciplinary approach to agriculture, focus on the production, focus on the conservation of natural areas and natural resources, and really in doing those things well, commit ourselves to the social responsibility. So, and that takes a lot of expertise. Transdisciplinary agriculture requires expertise in all of these areas. Agricultural sciences, as I represent, natural sciences, as I used to represent in a different life, and sort of focus on bringing those two things together in my current job, the land management, the engineering and the genetics, and of course the social sciences that bring all of us together and has really been a backdrop for this conversation we're having about awareness and intervention. So I just want to be clear about my words. What is transdisciplinarity, besides something a few syllables short of supercalifragilistic? Okay. Transdisciplinary science is really deep integration across disciplines. It's us coming together as folks who don't otherwise have something to talk about and figure out how we can have a meaningful conversation. That meaningful sharing of knowledge and information. Again, it brings us together to really sort of integrate our communities and find a common language in what we're doing. And that requires us to establish new frameworks and paradigms and disciplines. One of those disciplines which I represent here today. And what's helpful in drawing on transdisciplinary science is that we're really focusing on a specific and compelling problem. People are getting sick from the food they eat, and we're here to talk about how we can make a difference in that problem. And that requires us to come up with some not new and innovative solutions. And I think focusing on the solutions is something that I hope to move this conversation towards. We've been really clear with articulating the problem. I think getting this group together to focus on what we can do next will be a great part of our afternoon. And of course, it takes us working well together. So I mentioned transdisciplinary science, and I am the first agroecologist at the University of Florida. Agroecology being a transdisciplinary science by definition. There are now two of us, just to be clear about that, and our program is growing. But sort of what I want to acknowledge is that the way that I see science and my role in science is to really facilitate the type of conversation that we're having today, the opportunity to establish a solution and a framework that is really driven towards achieving a solution in these real-world problems. So I'll take a brief aside just to describe, in my mind, what is agroecology. It's a dynamic activity by the nature of being a transdisciplinary approach, both a science, an academic endeavor, but it's also a social movement and a farming practice. And based on who you talk to and how they've been integrated into agroecology, they kind of see it a little bit differently. One of those wicked communication problems is saying your discipline and either someone having absolutely no idea what it is or another person having some relatively narrow view on what it is that you're trying to communicate with them. But ultimately, agroecology comes to you as a systems framework, the awareness of systems thinking, evaluation, and management. And of course, it really pushes towards the sustainability and those long-term responsibilities towards environmental and social endeavors. So I won't bore you with sort of the introductory lecture of what is agroecology, but I want to focus on some of these foundational principles, okay? And this sort of can give you the foundation of where I come from as a scientist to understand these facets of agriculture and food systems. Sustainability, systems thinking. I'm going to say systems a lot today. Of course, the production. We all have to feed the world. Whose responsibility it is to feed the world is a whole nother conversation. That's a whole nother day that we can talk about that. And then focusing on the diversity, both biologically and culturally, and all those sorts of manners of diversity as possible. And that leads towards resilience, something that I think we're getting at here from sort of a roundabout way as far as this aflatoxin discussion goes. How do we make sure our food system is resilient to this contamination? So agroecology puts all these things together, the production, the conservation, and the responsibility. And I think about it as sort of the sum of agroecological awareness along with our navigation of agroecosystems that lead towards sustainability, quality food to feed the world. So what is an agroecosystem? I wanted to make sure that I had at least one livestock in this talk. Okay, so that's my goat from my farm in Utah. But this is really a big picture view of the problem. I asked earlier sort of when did this problem first arrive, and I can start sort of talking about different levers in the sort of establishment of our current food system, but I imagine that there's some things built into our agroecosystems that were changed as we started producing more livestock, more peanuts, more corn in these developing countries, and maybe some of those levers are things that we might want to consider in our dialogue. So this is a cartoon of an agroecosystem, and it really focuses on the various different scales and levels of complexity from the organism to the ecosystem. And I really like working through cartoons. I think it helps us understand our problem from a bigger picture, and so I'll do that quickly. With this example. So agroecosystems have various different scales from the organism, which is sort of a single entity, whether it's a crop or a livestock, the population, which is a group of that crop or livestock, the community. So if we're talking about a plant community or an animal community, we can understand how that goes. Of course, there are a lot of folks in Florida that are doing really great work in the community of forage grasses and plants, and I think that's really innovative work that's important to consider in this context, and the ecosystem, not just the environmental factors, but the various different communities, the plant community, the animal community, the invertebrate community, the fungal community. I mean, when was it that our agricultural soils lost the opportunity to regulate itself, and the fungus, the good fungus that are in the soil that keep away the bad fungus that we've been talking about all morning? And of course, all of these scales and boundaries provide us with information, which, if we're doing this effectively, then requires all of our disciplines, all of these disciplines that come together in our transdisciplinary approach must be present, must be at the table to have this conversation so that we can move towards these innovative solutions. So I just want to wrap up with an example, sort of why I was asked to be here today. I have just been involved in a project on peanut aflatoxin here in the southeastern United States, and so I'll speak from a little bit of that project that we're embarking on as far as my involvement with this working group. And so the peanut agroecosystem then is something that's really important to be considering when we begin to understand aflatoxin. So the organism is the peanut, the population is multiple peanuts put together, the community is the peanut and the weeds and all the other things that are going on in the farm field, and then the ecosystem, that's the peanuts and the natural area in the background and the soils and all of those things. And then the agro-ecosystem, that farm-level approach or that regional approach, then sort of gets expanded out to the food system. Something that this is sort of a figure that or a diagram that we've seen a couple times today. You start with your crop, it's harvested, it's shelled or processed, and then it's stored. And somewhere along that line, we get contamination from peanut, and we've got to figure out what to do about it. And one of those things to do about it is just to be aware of what's going on, right? Where in this food system are peanuts being contaminated with aflatoxin, and how can we understand the risks of this system and the opportunities to mitigate those risks? Of course, as we've talked about, much more prevalent and advanced in the southeastern part of Florida than it is in many of the parts of Africa that we've been talking about. And so having this communication across our countries, our worlds, our scientific backgrounds is really important to understand what we know in the United States and what we know in Africa and other parts of the world, and how can we find a common understanding. So my work with Dr. Diane Rowland and Barry Tillman from the Center for Stress Resilient Agriculture focuses on this peanut aflatoxin risk assessment. We're also working with Dr. Relina Zaire in the College of Engineering and several folks in Georgia Tech to sort of establish our monitoring and management systems. So the project that I'm on sort of seeks to address these three questions. How can we better manage for aflatoxin in peanut? How can we better monitor for aflatoxin in peanut? And then what are the points of vulnerability and risk in the peanut aflatoxin food system? So this research is a model for all of the things that we've been talking about, and I'm really interested in being here today to figure out how I can do this very specific and siloed sort of research project and make it relevant for all the things that we're trying to talk about today. So the peanut aflatoxin management is ultimately this decision-making framework, peanut farm, and you can put in information about your farm, you can understand the weather, you can understand your management practice, and it'll sort of spit out an idea of how much you should be irrigating or how much crop you can be expecting at the end of the year. We'd like to add in the aflatoxin risk and make it clear that maybe your farm's at risk for aflatoxin, but not just the farm level. So if we start understanding the whole agro-ecosystem, then maybe it's the corner of your farm that's shaded half of the day that might be more at risk for aflatoxin than sort of the drier parts of your farm. And instead of just sending a truck of peanuts that were sort of mixed from your farm and getting that tested and spit back to you, we can start understanding when and how to partition the risk across your farm to lessen the impact of aflatoxin. This takes a lot of information, this takes a lot of awareness, and making that manageable for folks in the United States is our first question, but really strikes me today the question of how do we make this viable across the board as well. So then the monitoring part, this really is the high-tech stuff. Got a lot of engineers on board also using some spectral imaging to understand not just peanut maturity, but risk and aflatoxin, and then these spectral signatures here of the images. We're also looking at volatile organic compounds, and can we basically smell the peanut and understand whether or not there's aflatoxin in there. This is just a depiction of one way where we can look at this spectral signature, see the peanut's normal, and look over here. Understanding what the problem is and the breadth of the problem, and that monitoring is that first important step. And this is my fun task as the data scientist and the scientist doing the synthesis of the project. I get to take what's going on farm, with what we find at the harvest scale and the storage scale, and take all of these pieces of monitoring and the risk factors and put it into a model to understand how do we understand aflatoxin contamination. So this will take a few minutes for you to digest, and I won't take the few minutes for you to digest it, but suffice it to say that this is sort of the simple model, conceptual model, which happens today. We go from field production to sort of the harvest and the buying to the shelling and the processing, and we do a couple tests. Mold here, and if there's mold, we toss it, okay? But there's probably a little bit better logic to how we do this, and a little bit more adaptive framework which we can put to the aflatoxin system, which includes this adaptive management, sort of understanding where on your farm you need to observe risk. Can we put that aflo safe into a farm, or can we manage the farm to have more beneficial fungus to bring down our risk, but then sort of various different modern technologies to do our monitoring, potentially adding cleaning opportunities to remove the uncontaminated peanuts back into the system. So this is what we're trying to accomplish in a nutshell. As I give this talk more and more, I'll move more towards that cartoon goal that I set up to, but sort of adding some complexity to the system might actually help increase the amount of food that's available to, and of course the economic benefit to the farmers. Okay, so I was also tasked with describing my role in extension. Okay, so I am at the Tropical Research and Education Center in Homestead, Florida, just south of Miami. I work in the Redland Agricultural District, and there are farmers there who want to talk to me and have me solve their problems. And being responsible to my community as an extension specialist is very important to me and very important to guide the work that I'm doing. So not only am I doing these broad reaching research projects, but I'm also responsible to the folks in my community. And that sort of conversation that we have is set up in an extension framework. Now again, we can sort of do a whole series of workshops or discussion about exactly what extension is and how is it relevant to this group. We're going to be having a workshop in communication later on today after lunch, really get at some of that role of us as scientists and academics in communicating what it is that we're doing. But I just wanted to put up these couple points to describe sort of how my role as an extension specialist guides the type of conversation that I'm having today. So it's really important to me to speak from my experience and the evidence that I've gathered. So usually the first conversation that I have with someone in South Florida is, "Hey, I'm not from around here." And they go, "Yeah, we know, because I don't dress like I'm from Miami or anything. I don't wear flowers on my shirts, and I tuck in my shirt sometime." Anyways, and so it really becomes a dialogue. How do we build trust from this gringo from Connecticut, and how can I help them learn something about their farm? Well, it sort of takes us to go down a road. We have to participate in the same problem. They then want to tell me their problems. I want to learn from them. I ask them sort of to help me understand what it is that they're going through so that I can incorporate their needs into my work. And so just participating in this dialogue with the farmers, with the local decision makers is really important to establishing my role as an extension specialist in South Florida, in the state of Florida, and with the work that I hope to do with One Health globally. So there's many different ways to have these direct and interactive communication sessions, from field days. We welcome farmers to our research station all the time, specifically when we have interesting things to show them. They come along, they see what we're up to, and of course the champions then, the folks that take on what we're doing and add their own innovations to the things that we're working on, then invite other farmers to their farms, and really that's how we're able to establish a community of folks that are tackling the real-world agricultural problems that are faced in our region. When we don't have the examples, we're able to put together workshops and have these conversations as focus groups to really establish the best path forward. I'm not allowed to say basic or theoretical in any extension thing that I do, because it really has to resonate with these folks, and they've really got to see how it impacts them. And so these field days and workshops are the best way to do that. I mentioned this a little bit, but the farmer-to-farmer innovation, this is really something at the foundation of agroecology, those farm schools, the campesina, the farmers talking to each other and understanding their farm. Listen, their agroecological awareness is way more than mine can ever be. I can quantify that awareness, I can put that into a model, but the observations and the interactions that they have on their farm day to day is so intimate, and making sure that they understand the thought process that takes that intimacy and allows them to adapt and learn and really focus on something that's tangible as opposed to intuitive is sort of where our role as Extension can help guide forward a community of farmers. And then, just like we were talking about the transdisciplinary science, it really has to be goal-oriented. Those impacts are really important. Just having folks in the room and changing their understanding, that knowledge is exceedingly important. But then you take that knowledge and they really buy into it and they start changing their actions, then your impacts can really have a difference. And then if there's enough observation of those changes in actions, then you change the decision makers, you change the dynamic of the community. And those conditional shifts, those paradigm shifts in our communities is really what we're going towards as an extension organization. So how do you take a model and move it over towards management? Well, it's certainly not just showing a farmer this picture and telling them that they should do it. And it's certainly not just the arrow from this work that I'm doing in research to the farmer. It's really got to be that sort of two-way interaction, that dialogue between the really deep thinking that I'm doing aside from the day-to-day problems that they're facing and really incorporating the work that they're doing. So I think by and large, the discussion that we're having for the rest of the day sort of really gets at this dynamic, sort of how can we build a transdisciplinary team to not just do the research, but to do the extension, to determine where these levers are in our aflatoxin risk, and how can we make sure that we're able to make a difference in those impacts in our communities. So with that, I will say thanks and move on towards our panel discussion.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to stay there because you're one of our moderators, along with Ilaria Capua, and I invite you to come up, as well as the other panelists. This is a bit of a transition, so if our panelists could come forward. There is one panelist who's not available, and Cristiano had a conflict, but she will be here later today, as we understand. And then we do have one panelist who has not been introduced yet, so I'm just going to quickly let you know who he is. That is Ricky Telg, who's right here. He's the director of the Center for Public Issues Education in Agriculture and Natural Resources here at UF. So the others have been briefly introduced and spoken to you, so hopefully you have lots of questions for all of them. We do have our two moderators who are going to take things over. So do we have enough chairs?
We have enough chairs, but we don't have enough microphones.
Well, do we have any more mics in the building? Well, we can pass it around. We can also use this one too. So Ilaria, is that coming up?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jim. Thank you. And I would really like to say a big thank you to Olga. Can you please stand up, Olga? Olga has been the soul of this. We've been trying to organize this for a very long time, and it was her determination and her will to put this together that actually made us be here today, of course, with the collaboration of everyone else, but it's her. No, and of course Saskia was essential, yes. But how much did we pester Saskia? So thank you, Olga, and thank you, Saskia. Okay, I thought that this morning was extremely interesting from many points of view. And we now have, I think, quite a demanding task, which is that of fleshing out the major issues that we should try and address to get into our next phase, because this meeting will be a success, especially if we manage to move on to a phase 2. And what I have been really struck by this morning is the amount of, I would say, contradiction there is in so many good things that we are trying to do, and how difficult it is to do good things, especially if you're working in an under-resourced context, or in a context that has problems that are very different from ours. And so just to give you an idea of where I find these contradictions, these conflicts in essence, I would say we heard at the start the word poison, and poison comes with milk. And milk is essential to get babies off the ground. And so this is, it is a disaster if you think about it, poison in milk. Because also of what it means to the families and to how families interact with agriculture, and of how families interact with institutions, and how much trust families have with institutions. We then have, I think, another great contradiction or difficulty, which is there is unsettling news. And this unsettling news needs to be communicated. Because if you don't communicate it, why are you doing this in the first place? And you have to be transparent. Zach mentioned the word transparency a lot. And transparency is another one of the big challenges that we have in the future. And then finally, I would like to say the word standard. Okay, standard should mean one thing, but standard means different things in different countries. And so aflatoxins are now a very big problem in some under-resourced countries, like the countries we are working in. But aflatoxins have been a problem in Europe and are still a gigantic problem in Europe as well. And a lot of European products cannot be put on the market because of the level of aflatoxin in the milk. What I was thinking as we were, moving into the discussion was, as Saskia knows, and as the veterinarians in this room know, with diseases or with problems in the veterinary environment, we move towards a progressive eradication. So you get rid of that disease if it's an endemic disease, and if you want to get rid of it progressively. And you go through different phases. And before the aflatoxin regulation came in force in Europe, Europeans were eating products that were highly contaminated with aflatoxin. And it wasn't that long ago. And it was probably the same in the States. And so going back to the word standard, we have to understand that when we talk about a standard, we have to be very careful because it is clear that in Africa we cannot have the same standards of aflatoxin contamination in feed because they've only started addressing the problem. And so this is not really so much about rich countries can do it and poor countries cannot. It is about, it's a long way to get there. Rich countries started earlier, poor countries started after, and they are still in the pipeline. And we have to manage this issue in its complexity. So I would like to ask my first question, and then I will leave the mic to my co-chair, Renata. The first question I would like to ask Dr. Bola. So what is, according to you, the main issue which we can reasonably attempt to address? So, of course, we're not going to address fixing poverty in the world, but we need an objective that you see is within reach and that is prioritary in relation to the many things that we've heard this morning.
Thank you. Thank you, Lyria. So this morning we've been talking about risk communication, particularly in the context of aflatoxin. Lyria mentioned transparency, standards, and so on. For one of our research projects, when the project was completed and they finished the survey, they went to meet one of the state ministers, said we plan to have a multi-stakeholder workshop to release the results. And the state minister said, no, because I'm concerned that your work, when you get it out, it's going to cause more alarm. And my colleague who was leading that project said to me that he wants to be transparent, he doesn't want to be accused of being part of collusion, of hiding information. But I had to explain to him that we have to manage the communication process. We have to bring in the right stakeholders. And we have to get the word out in the right way and at the right time. So what we've decided to do now, and I'm sorry, I'm circling around, I'll come back to the question. What we've decided to do is look further into the problem, find some solutions, and then we can hold a workshop where we say, okay, this was the problem, we have found a solution, and then we can publicize it so that we don't avoid the issue of the press taking things out of context. And so I think the most important thing is that we have to be very careful and strategic in how we communicate our research results, particularly when it relates to contaminants in food. We have to be transparent, but at the same time, we need to bring in the right stakeholders. One of the questions Renata asked in her presentation was whether you should present everything to the public at the same time, or you should gather some select stakeholders and first of all present the information to them, and then progressively present it to the general public when you are at a stage where it is wise and safe to do so. And I think that strategy is much better. Otherwise, you just alarm people, and you might provide half-baked information which just causes hysteria. So I think that one of the main take-home messages from this symposium is that although we are researchers, and although our ultimate aim as we do research is to publish our findings, we have to also live in the real world. None of us would want to be responsible for destroying the dairy industry in a country where we work, or be responsible for malnutrition and having lifelong deleterious effects on the growth of children, on their mental performance, because we published a paper. So we need to weigh and balance our desire to publish with the real situation out there, bring on board the right stakeholders, and develop an appropriate strategy to communicate the research findings. Thank you.
Dr. Telg, you are an expert in communicating and in raising awareness, and so do you have any suggestions? Do you have any ideas? Do you have any comments?
Sure. Well, what you said was actually what I was going to say, so that was good. So I can reiterate what you just mentioned. Yes, there is the aspect of being transparent, but there is also the aspect that as scientists, the results of your research have impact. And how that impact is communicated is something that we collectively need to be very aware of. Going back to the slide that was mentioned this morning, only 1 in 5, let's see, I get my glasses on, only 1 in 5 samples were above the limits set by the US. That's what the research showed. But if you're looking at it from the standpoint of the general public or the media, and by the way, I was one of those. I was a professional journalist for many years in television, radio, and in newspaper. Yes, that medium that really doesn't exist that much anymore. You say something like that, and that is the results. But what does the media pick up on? What's the percentage there? Only 1 in 5 is what? 20%. And so they immediately pick up on that. And I'm not saying to hide the information, but I am saying that we need to be aware that our words have power to them. And so having those messages and deciding what those message frames are important. The idea of also finding those influencers, those opinion leaders, those stakeholders who have influence over others in their community and start at the process with them and then having them be your voice is also an aspect of good communication strategies, especially in under-resourced countries like this. I also would say that developing relationships is key to having successful communication. And that goes for us as scientists, as well as reaching out to those in the communities there in other countries, building relationships with farmers, what Zach said before about farmers to farmers, and having them be relay information to others who also see them as opinion leaders. And finally, I would just say to be aware of your audience. And that goes with me as a social scientist as well. Too many times, even here in the United States, we put a lot of information out, but we really haven't thought about the audience who's receiving this information. And so as a social scientist, one of the things I would recommend is finding out where they go for information, what types of media do they use, what messages resonate with them, because we all should be trying to share values with those around us. What common ground do we all have as both communicators and as scientists?
Thank you very much. Renata, would you like to interject?
Yes. I think I really agree with the previous interveners, and we have to be strategic in the way we communicate as scientists. Also, not to be too naive. I've been thinking a bit about the example of IRRI and the the flop with IRRI and Ethiopia, and the reaction. And I really don't know, but the question, if I heard this for the first time, the first question is, did this publication, the research really led to the collapse of the dairy industry? What are the data for this? As a social scientist, I would immediately say it could be that some dairy producers in a city in Addis Ababa were affected and some urban consumers shunned the milk. But do we have a sense that really there was a collapse of the dairy industry? So being also cognizant that there are maybe agenda about the effects of research on reality and compare the alleged effects of research with the actual ones. So, I mean, this is a question for all scientists. Do you really know the effect of your research publications on the actual reality? And are there studies, there even a strand of studies that analyze this? My feeling is that maybe we don't invest a lot of research on that. governments may react to research in different ways. And my experience between West Africa and East Africa led me to think that governments mind or fear the media in different ways. And so the way we go about it will be also very context dependent. This is not to deny the point, I mean, and actually to confirm the point that when we do research in a country, we want to be aware of who is attentive to what aspects and what is the role even of the media. And again, I go back to the point, in some cases media is free, in some cases is not as free.
Thank you, Renata. I wanted to just interject with a couple of ideas and then open the floor to any questions there may be. And so we have heard about the binders and mitigators of contamination. And so this is a question for Zach Brim, but I would like also Bola maybe to comment on it, and maybe also Ricky Telg. So because luckily time is not a burning issue just now, so this is a problem that is not like an epidemic disease that you need to react immediately, right? So a problem like this has a history. The history comes from how the crops are collected, the humidity, the rain, the heat and all the rest, and then how they are dried and how they get into the system and all of that. So we have a long process that needs to be governed. And therefore, we have more time. And what do you think, since you deal with farmers and you deal with people who, of course, are very different from the stakeholders we are talking about in Africa, but farmers are similar in many parts of the world. So communicating bad news, which I'm sure that you have to do here as well, because ugly things happen to crops here as well, and using a potential mitigation component when you communicate that. So, for example, saying there's 80% of the crops that are negative, 20% are positive, but we are immediately supporting you by offering you these mitigation strategies that can lower the content to what would be very close to zero. So what do you think as a strategy, as a mitigation strategy of putting like something that is seen as a way to solve the problem together with communicating the problem?
That is a great question. I've got a lot of things going on in my mind right now, so let me see if I can answer your question thoughtfully and sort of direct it with some of the other things that we've been going on. So the first thing that I want to chat about is the context. Agroecology as a discipline, and one of the things that I focus on is providing context to our conversation. So just as we were saying, 20% of the milk is dirty or poison or whatever, however you want to brand that situation, contaminated, and 80% is clean. When I think about that, that means if I have a bowl of cereal every day of the week, or during the weekday, I eat pancakes on the weekend, okay? So 5 days a week I have a bowl of cereal. That means that 1 in 5 of my bowl of cereal is contaminated. So effectively I have a contaminated bowl of cereal a week. So, and that's where I think some of the hysteria comes from, is that's what the folks see, whereas we see sort of the bigger picture, what that number means. So the context is really important. The other idea that I think about is sort of exactly what that means. So how many folks know how many invertebrate legs are able to be in your jar of tomato sauce by FDA? How many folks know? It's not 0. 6, sure. A tiny amount, right? But there are invertebrate legs in your jar of tomato sauce. That doesn't mean when you go home today. Legs. Like pieces of invertebrates, right? There's contamination in all of the food that we eat, okay? And so this is the context of the problem. So aflatoxin is a sort of indirect contaminant. You're not going to get liver cancer by having your bowl of cereal once a week. And so being very, and you're not going to, get any GI infection by having an invertebrate leg in your tomato sauce. But sort of being clear about what that means and the extent of the problem is one of the sort of wicked problems for what we're talking about. So now back to the farmers. I think ultimately it comes down to just that piece of context that there's two things going on. One, that aflatoxin's in every farmer's field. And being clear about that actual risk is really important, but also the implications of that risk. So how do you make sure that the crop or the livestock that comes off your farm is safe for the food to eat, and sort of how can you establish a process in order to do that? We have a really good example of not necessarily a public health issue in South Florida, but of course South Florida has all sorts of diseases that are causing problems for farmers in Homestead. The biggest problem right now is with the avocados. We have a disease called laurel wilt. It's just one of those big problems. This beetle is coming out of the natural areas and infesting our trees. And once you see the branches start wilting, then you got to take action immediately. In some cases, that means ripping out your entire farm and starting fresh, and that's not a viable solution. You can't tell a farmer to not farm for any length of time because that's how they're making their money. And so they come to us as a university research team and say, well, I just want to know what the best fungicide is to inject into my trees. And that's only a Band-Aid. And so sort of thinking about these issues and all the different levers, there are certain things that you can't tell farmers because it either means that you don't really care about their livelihood or you are in a little bit more secure of a place than they are. And so putting all of these pieces together, really being clear that there are trade-offs in what we're doing. It takes some time to understand how to Band-Aid the situation. It takes some more time in order to really come up with a systematic solution, right? How is it that we change the health of our agricultural region? Are there ways to keep the beetles off of these avocado orchards? Well, maybe if the avocado orchards are sort of spread out in a little bit different way, they're not just a lot of big avocado orchards stacked together. Maybe it means just sort of rotating thoughtfully our avocado orchards with other things. You can't really tell a farmer that they can't farm avocados for 10 years. You got to go do something else. Go do papaya or passion fruit or something. And so it's a wicked problem because as we were saying before, we understand the problems, we understand the risks, but each of our individual stakeholders understand those problems and risks in a slightly different way, and we've got to be really thoughtful about how we distribute that information and engage the folks. So it takes a lot of trust, takes a lot of thoughtfulness.
I think that as researchers working in this area, one of the things we need to do is think about the issue or the issues from the outset, before you do the research, and have a discussion with your administrators in the department. Because when you get to the point, it could be aflatoxin in Nigeria, it could be greening of citrus, it could be something with sugarcane, and you present the results and you discover that the clientele, and it could be a producer group, doesn't want you to publish the results, and you need those publications for your tenure and promotion process. So I think it's very important to have a dialogue with your administrators about this, because you may have to hold back those results, whether it's in Africa, or your work is in Africa, or it's here in Florida. Well, if we do decide to go ahead with publishing the results, and in fact, with our projects, we were very fortunate that this happened to ILRI and not to UF, because it could have happened to us if we had been the first people first to conduct the study. We were first in other countries, but not in Ethiopia. And I think if we're publishing that kind of information, we need to put the results in perspective. And so you're communicating a risk, but have you done a hazard analysis? So it's not just a question of a risk, but what is the true hazard? And what is the likelihood that Joe Public or the average person is really going to suffer something from this food item, from consuming? It's like when people talk about whole milk and 2% milk or whatever. And whenever I go to hotels and I don't see whole milk, I ask for whole milk. I say, where is your whole milk? Because, you know, people are all up in arms about fat in milk, and they've ignored nutritional studies about the nutritional benefits of the fat in milk. And the same people who will drink 2% milk will load up on fries and fried chicken and so on. So it's important to present the results in perspective. Where it's possible, have a hazard analysis done as well, so that when the information is conveyed in context, and people can see, okay, relative to the risk of smoking, or relative to the risk of eating whatever is not good for you, drinking sodas in these large cups where you can get so many refills. You know, when you quantify and you put that in perspective, then somebody goes home and understands that, okay, there is a risk here, but relative to the other issues, it's not so bad. And so it's not quite the same alarming message as saying that there is a 1 in 5 chance of having a problem if I consume this food product. The second thing is, wherever possible, providing solutions or mitigation strategies and providing that information. But better still, if possible, providing solutions that have worked in the local context to address the problem, not just something that may work. It's not always possible to wait for those kinds of interventions take place and then you have the results and you can report them simultaneously, but wherever possible, that was very helpful. And the last thing I would say is, working in this systems context. For many years as an animal science researcher, my whole focus was on conducting my research to improve animal production, improve milk production, and publishing my research in the Journal of Dairy Science. That was what I focused on. Now, with the Innovation Lab, I'm thinking about the wider ramifications of what I do. I'm thinking about policy impacts. I'm thinking about impacts on human nutrition and so on and so forth. And so the advantage of having these centers of excellence, like the One Health, like the Stress Resilience Center, like the Livestock Systems Innovation Lab, is that you have the opportunity to bring in people from other disciplines, and you can actually discuss with them what are going to be the likely implications of putting this information out. What are the policy implications? What are the what kinds of, bringing people like Ricky who can advise you on what kind of behavior change awareness campaigns are needed to get the information out in the appropriate manner. So thank you.
Thank you, Bola. Ricky, would you like to? Yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up a couple of things that have been mentioned about engagement and about dialogue. That's been a discussion topic up here and in Zach's presentation too, is that we have to have this two-way street to be able to have behavior change in the individuals we would like to see that in. Too many times in the past as scientists, we've really focused on what's called the deficit model of communication, that the people who are hearing our results are at a deficit. And so if we just hit them over the head with information, they will accept this and change behavior. And as we've learned, that's not the case at all. How do we know that? Well, there's a lot of research out there that says smoking's not good for you. Well, guess what? People still smoke. So it's not just the information, it's the dialogue of trying to mitigate these behaviors. And someone may never change their behavior to smoke, but again, finding out what that person's shared value is. It's like, well, if you have a small child and you're smoking, guess what? Your child can suffer from what? Secondhand smoke. So if you're going to smoke, do what? Move outside. So make sure that the behavior is relevant and is something that people could accept and do. We did some research in the Center for Public Issues Education about 1.5 years ago And what we try to do with we call it the PI Center, is to do research on public perceptions and knowledge of different issues related to agriculture and natural resources, and then develop communication strategies to inform and hopefully to change where necessary minds and attitudes about these things. We did some research with extension agents who were, their primary group that they worked with were cattle ranchers out in the desert Southwest. So these are the animal extension agents. And the topic that was for this day-long seminar was on climate change, about communicating about climate change. And what we found during these focus groups with these extension agents, whose primary clientele was cattle ranchers in Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, was that the term climate change was one thing that they did not talk about with their cattle ranchers, about the practices that they had there to enhance the idea of mitigating climate change. Instead, what they wanted to do was to talk about other topics, because the term climate change itself has such a negative connotation, at least with their clientele. So we talked about what are some other ways to communicate that message. And so they said the messages that we want to communicate were based on economic profitability, that these practices that would, again, mitigate climate change also enhance their profitability, enhance their environmental stewardship. But again, it's how we phrase and how we communicate these messages. And again, knowing who your audience is and what their values are will help to, in this case, when we're talking about aflatoxin, I would think, to help people's behavior change in such a way that they would accept these practices that would mitigate aflatoxin.
Well, thank you very much. I see Jim Harper, who is stretching his legs, I don't think because he needs exercise, but because he is keeping time. I just wanted to know if there are any burning questions or comments. We do reconvene here after lunch as a extended group, and we will have Ann Cristiano, who will talk to who is an expert in communication and in communicating science. So she will come. She will be here in the afternoon, and will give us her point of view before we have a smaller group and develop, let's say, a few action points. Would anyone like to?
Thank you. And also at lunch, I hope you continue these conversations.
Thank you for the very interesting panel. I just wanted to kick things off with one question. I really liked the discussion about the insect legs in the tomato sauce versus, the standards that we have. And if you told me, do you want to buy tomato sauce with insect legs in it, I would say no. And if you told me, do you want to buy a tomato sauce that meets our government standards for health and safety, I would say yes. Both of those things can be true at the same time. So my question for Dr. Telg and the others was on how you compete, not necessarily with misinformation, since both statements are true in fact, but rather with these different perceptions that can compete against each other when we are communicating on difficult and complex topics. One suggestion that Dr. Adesogan had about putting the threat in context seems helpful, but maybe there are more specific examples about the most effective way to do that and ways that that has been proven effective when communicating.
That's great question, great topic. And that's what we're really talking about here, about the type of messaging. Both of those would be absolutely correct. But again, it's based on what we believe, and hopefully that would be done by some research to find out what those messages are that would resonate with our audience. So again, we're not trying to obfuscate the information, trying to hide the things, but we're trying to relate information that would be accepting and acceptable to our audience. And this is done all the time in communication, research, and application and strategies, is to find those messages that resonate with your audience, that move them to, in this case, an attitude of persuasion in such a way that they would then accept these strategies that we're talking about. So I don't think it's one or the other. And it may be that based on the audience, there may be different audiences, and that you would use one particular message for an audience versus another. So just understand that one message does not always meet the needs of all of the audiences that you have as well.
Hello, my name is Octavio Gomez. I'm a graduate student here at the university. This is a question primarily relating to climate change. Since the fomentation of aflatoxin is directly involved with like higher levels of heat and humidity, I was just wondering, since the countries that are mostly going to be affected by climate change are in kind of the tropical regions, what is the role of like the West and external actors in trying to mitigate the effects of like this issue that's being exacerbated by climate change, and what can we do here to spread awareness that, you know, our actions, you know, are pollution here in the West, and, you know what I mean, we contribute disproportionately to the issue. So how do we embrace that dialogue here, especially when we aren't the ones who stand the most to lose in this situation?
Okay, thank you for bringing up the question on climate change. As a livestock researcher, I usually get a question on climate change. That's a very good question. And aflatoxin, you know, the temperature, high humidity, predisposing factors, as you mentioned. And I'm going to mispronounce your last name. Is it Dr. Hogenboom? Okay, Hogenboom. Okay, he and Dr. Booty, he was just telling me that they have been funded by USAID to do a modeling exercise looking at effects of climate change on aflatoxin in some of these developing countries. So watch this space. But I think we can almost predict what the results of that research will be, is that the levels are likely to be higher. And so we have to even double up on our mitigation strategies. Now, to directly address your question about what is being done on this whole issue of climate change, in the countries where we work and in developing countries across the world, especially those in the tropics and subtropics, there's a high awareness about climate change, and you don't have the level of opposition to climate change that you do in some quarters in the US. So they see it more as a fact and as something that they need to prepare for, and so they're already preparing for it. And many of the faculty here at IFAS have been, and in other parts of UF, have been working on adapting agricultural systems to climate change. Within the livestock, the animal sciences department is an area, or one of our areas of focus, and I think FAO estimates that if we deploy the strategies that we're aware of, we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions from livestock systems by 30%. And in fact, I'll say this because often you hear about livestock and the environment, and you hear about livestock are ruining the environment and causing a huge problem from a greenhouse gas standpoint. I want to mention that we absolutely need to be good environmental stewards. There's no question about that, and livestock do contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. But we need to, again, look at things in context. So livestock contribute, but livestock researchers here at UF and in many other parts of the US, developing world, developed world, have been working on mitigation strategies, and many of these are very effective. But we can't look at the environment alone and just focus on being environmental stewards and ignore the food needs of the world. So by 2050, the estimations are that the world population is going to be about 10 billion. And we need to feed the world. So we need to care for the environment, and we need to feed the world. And livestock play an extremely vital role in feeding the world. And so we can't ignore the role of livestock. And so rather than just looking at the total amount of greenhouse gases emitted by anything, whether it's motor vehicles or agricultural systems, pig production, rice paddies, and so on, we should look at how much emissions are produced in relation to how much food is produced at the same time. So when you look at those two things, you have this index we call emissions intensity, and it says how much greenhouse gases are produced per unit of food. And when you look at things that way, that's a very helpful way of addressing the environmental stewardship needs that we have, as well as the needs to feed the world. And when you do that, you find that there's a lot that can be learned from US agriculture that can be taken to the developing world. Because there's a lot of greenhouse gas. If you think about a US cow, one US cow produces about 22,000 pounds of milk a year, produces about 400 grams of methane. That single cow produces much more methane than an average cow in Nigeria. But to produce the same amount of milk as that US cow, we may need 20 Nigerian cows. And the amount of methane that will be generated from those 20 Nigerian cows may be 5 times as much as that from that single US cow. So what I'm saying is that we need to balance our need to feed or be good environmental stewards with the need to also feed the world. And when we do that, we find that livestock are not a pariah, rather they are a very critical part of the whole system. Last point I will make, because the words milk, contaminant, poison, aflatoxin have been used often during this morning. Please, anyone listening, milk is a wholesome livestock product. It is great for you. It is great for your babies. We have excellent ways of keeping milk safe, particularly here in the US and in the West, so I don't want anyone to go away with the wrong impression. Thank you.
We'll just,
Can I address that real quick?
yes. And then we'll take one more question and have our closing comments.
Yeah, I want to address this because this is new information out just this past week for the Center for Food Integrity. It relates specifically to what you asked and some of your comments there. For those of you who are aware, several years ago we had what we call a communications debacle related to genetically modified organisms, and the terms there and the idea is that GMOs are bad for you, and so everyone in the scientific community said, what? No, they're safe. And so the next argument was like, well, GMOs are good to feed the world. And that kind of argument went south too. And so now with the increase in the idea of gene editing, the Center for Food Integrity commissioned a study to look at consumers here in the United States, their views about the benefits to agriculture and what consumers can see as a result of that. And so I say this because if we're trying, your question was about what the West can do and what our thoughts can be about this, about climate change specifically. We have to be aware that even though we in this room think that that the benefits in terms of aflatoxin, trying to mitigate that, is to help to feed the world, as you mentioned. For a lot of consumers, that's not the case. And so we have to find those messages that resonate. And so the top 3 messages that the Center for Food Integrity found, again, just released this past week, was if we can resonate with them on the ideas of gene editing being beneficial for environmental stewardship, which you mentioned, disease resistance, and nutritional benefits for those who eat food that have been gene edited. That's the most important 3. The very bottom, least important in terms of US consumers, guess what? Feed the world. Feed the world. And I don't know why, but I would argue to say that because we in the United States are well fed, have safe food, it's not seen as important to us as it would be to potentially other countries around the world. So I say that because, again, looking at the messaging is important not only in Rwanda and Nigeria, but it's also here in the United States, that even though our goal here would be to feed the world, we need to make sure that the way that we frame those messages are also such that consumers, those who would support the things that we're talking about here, would do so in such a way that it gets to what we're really wanting them to do, even though that may not be their primary reason why. So.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Martha Hartman, and I'm an emeritus faculty member in the Department of Agricultural Education and Communication. And I want to thank you, every one of the panelists, for your informative presentation, particularly for mentioning the importance of the context and importance of understanding the audience, of taking in consideration the values of those with whom we are communicating, with whom we are engaging in a discussion. But I like to really stress the importance of having the knowledge, the understanding, and the competencies of addressing those cognitive and affective and behavioral differences with the audiences with whom we are communicating. It's not enough knowing that we need to translate highly technical information to non-technical one, but understanding what are the communicative patterns that are preferred in a particular context. Understanding the daily routines, if you will, of the audiences, understanding what the reality is of the particular stakeholders. When we talk about risk, we need to know and we need to have the competencies necessary to deal with how people perceive risk, because what we consider something as risk, it may not be considered in another context, something in the risk, or risk responses are not the same. Risk communication is not something that is universal. So I like to stress the importance of not only understanding, being sensitive to those differences, but having the appropriate skills to be effective.
Can I just take, thanks Martha for this point, and actually helps me to go and address some of the points, but I think your plea for understanding the perspectives of people, stakeholders we talk to, is very important. And so as a social scientist to scientist, I would like to say, I understand it can be frustrating to produce a technological or some scientific innovation that can feed the world, that can help address basic needs and not seeing these opposed. And you mentioned GMO, and we mentioned, we can think of other things. At the same time, I think it's important to understand the reasons for oppositions. And so, although we may want to be very stern on the properties of the technical innovations we deliver, we understand that there may be other things that the technical efficiency, and as I don't want to open a conversation on GMO, but there's a whole political aspect of it, maybe the reason for oppositions. And so here it's an example of how to communicate. Instead of dismissing these counter arguments, maybe we can understand how an innovation can be applicable in a changed institutional political context that is more equitable. I'm here being very veiled, but people who know the context, understand what I'm talking about. And so again, for aflatoxin, the solutions we propose, some of them may be more efficient, may not be applicable to the context. And I think we need scientists, social scientists, and policymakers to really hone down, really unpack these issues. And so going back to the idea of communications and to our communication specialists, I'd like to find a different term than workshops. Workshop is overused. We do so many in Africa. They are in fancy hotels with a lot of media, and that's often the end of the effect of the workshops. Can we find another name in which we can communicate scientific results, but also, as Bola was saying, think of policy solution, but in a very dialogue, open way in which we understand why some people may not be friendly to certain solutions and understand how we can implement them. So it was, hopefully we will continue the conversation, but that is my plea.
Thank you, Renata, for these conclusive words, but not so conclusive. These, I would say, because every new little aspect that we look into, of course, it fits perfectly into the picture, and we will have a hard time this afternoon trying to distill how we're going to put everything together. So I would like to close this morning's session by mentioning again all the little centers that put together their efforts to create this event, and of course the Livestock Innovation Lab, Bola and Saskia, but also the Center for African Studies, the Center for Stress Resilient Agriculture, and the Center and the One Health Center. We are just little fireflies in the universe of UF. But if we fly together, maybe we can shine a little bit more light than what we do by ourselves. Of course, great thanks to IFAS and to Animal Sciences, who are providing us with lunch and that have provided us with support. And I will see you all after lunch and hopefully after fruitful fly discussions at 1:10 p.m. Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you. Zach Brim came all the way from Homestead, so thank you very much for being here with us and telling us the lovely things that you do, and we'll see you later on. Bye-bye.
And before we get started, we actually have a special guest right next to me. I'll let him introduce himself, but he had some thoughts about this morning's session.
Thank you, Jim. My name is David Salmons. I am the current chair of the External Advisory Board for the Innovation Lab, a position that I've held for about a year and a half. I'm actually the outgoing chair, but have much enjoyed participating closely with the lab, reviewing proposals, reviewing the accomplishments of the lab, etc., and have particularly had an interest in how we communicate the information that's being generated by the wonderful group of scientists we have working with the lab. And so this, I think, today's session is absolutely critical to the continuing success of the lab. As some of you may know, the lab was funded for 5 years. You heard Bola mention the funding that was received, and we're going into our 4th year now. So over the next year, there's going to have to be a good deal of energy put into thinking about how we renew the lab for another 5 years. We are clearly have put together a cohort of very high quality and capable people, and the real goal that we have at this point now is how do we sustain what we have started and continue to build into the future, and being able to communicate effectively the accomplishments that have accumulated over the last 3.5, almost 4 years is going to be really important to the well-being and the future activities of the Innovation Lab. So this has, I think, been really a perfectly positioned symposium. Then I wanted to say one thing, just in sort of thinking about encapsulating this morning's conversations around communication. You've all probably been in the situation where someone has come up to you and they've said, well, I've got good news for you and I've got bad news for you. And then which do you want to hear first? And of course, some of us will say, well, give me the bad news first. And some will say, no, I'd rather have the good news first. In some ways, much of what we've been talking about, and I think about your question this morning, Lacey, insect legs and tomato sauce, it's a good news, bad news in a sense. If someone came up to me and said, here's a jar of tomato sauce, do you want the good news or the bad news? Well, the good news is that it meets government specifications and is perfectly safe to eat. The bad news is it has a half dozen insect legs in it. And this, I think, is what we've been talking about. How do we convey information in a way that is positive, that will not shut down the listener, the audience, right at the outset? And how do we communicate that information such that people can use it in a understandable sort of way? And I imagine we're going to hear more about this in the communication that is about to be presented at this point. But I offer that simply as my own mental exercise in trying to encapsulate what we talked about this morning. What is the information? How is it communicated? And how is it framed so that the audience that receives that information can make good use of it in an effective and a continuing sort of way? So, Jim, thank you.
Thank you, David, for those comments. So we're going to jump right ahead and get started. And again, I welcome people to move to the front because I think you're going to really want to pay attention. I know I am. I'm a professional communicator, but you always have to be learning about how to do it, and every situation is different. So we're going to be learning about some of the situations today from the director of this new Center for Public Interest Communications here at UF.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm so honored to be part of such an important discussion today and such a terrific group of people whose work I admire so much. My name is Ann Cristiano, and I am the Frank Correll Chair in Public Interest Communications and the director of a just established Center on Public Interest Communications here at UF. And I'm super proud of that and excited to tell you a little bit more about that. But I'd rather start with a story that has nothing whatsoever to do with the topic that we're discussing. And this story takes place on where all the best stories do, which is on a dark and stormy night. On this particular dark and stormy night in the mid-1700s, somebody who had worked as a slave ship captain was on a ship returning home to Donegal, Ireland. And during that night, the ship that he was on hit rocks, and a huge hole appeared in the side of the ship. That former slave ship captain called out to God, and he said, I will devote my life to ending the slave trade if you spare me. At that moment, all of the barrels that were in the ship's hold shifted toward that hole, and the ship was able to limp to shore. And that slave ship captain joined with others and kept his promise and created the Society to Effect the End of the Slave Trade. That group of individuals met in London and worked for 20 years to end the international slave trade. They included members of parliament. They included journalists. They included faith leaders. And they worked throughout the country, throughout Europe, to change how people thought about slavery. One of the things that they did was they created what is recognized as being the first infographic, a map of what a ship looked like in the Middle Passage. And they published these on posters and put them in pubs all over Europe where people could sit and reflect and think about them and talk about them with their friends. And imagine how horrifying it would have been to endure that kind of passage. They also created a boycott of sugar, and they chose sugar because sugar was a product that was produced almost entirely by slave labor and that was purchased by women. And they chose that because they didn't have another way to engage women in their campaign. But women were the people who bought most household goods. And by engaging them in this campaign, they decreased the demand for sugar by 30% throughout the world, which was really powerful because it showed that the economic link to slavery could be severed. Oh, and that captain who I told you about wrote a song about that experience that you know, and the song is called Amazing Grace. So I'm here at University of Florida because of this man. His name is Frank Carell. He graduated from the University of Florida in 1961, and he was passionate about the University of Florida, and he was passionate about science. So much so that the year after he graduated, he went on to the Miami Herald, where he said to them, "There's all of this space exploration happening in your backyard. You need a science reporter." And they said, "You're right, and you should be it." And so he was the Miami Herald's first science reporter doing amazing work. And there's one of his lead stories right there. I was so excited the day I went over to the library and pulled it up on microfilm and saw Frank's words. I met Frank when I was at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. He had decided that before he retired, he was going to hire somebody early in her career and mentor her and teach her how to use strategic communications to drive social change. Frank retired, and when he started to think about what his legacy would be, one of the things that he decided to do was to fund a position at the University of Florida, a chair in public interest communications, so that young people could choose using strategic communications to drive social change as a career. They could study it as undergraduates. He also envisioned connecting people who were working in this field who previously didn't know what to call their work, bringing them together, unifying them as a community. And his third piece of the vision was to identify scholarship that could advance our practice of this field and inspire more people to do research in this area. So all of that work is underway. I decided to apply for the Carell Chair when I was speaking at Frank's memorial service, and the dean of the college showed up in testimony to Frank's incredible legacy. So I feel incredibly lucky to have been on this path, but it is also true that I feel that communication of science toward the public good is very much part of how I was raised as a professional. So, public interest communications is probably a term that's new to many of you, but that probably also makes intuitive sense to the kinds of people who do what you do. It's science-based, it's planned, it's integral to profound and lasting change on an issue that advances the common good. So you may be more familiar with public relations, which is the communication that an organization engages in its own interest. And you are certainly familiar with journalism, but public interest communications brings the best of them together. It requires us to move beyond communicating about an organization to really communicating about an issue. And it forces us to get intensely focused on the thing that we are trying to make true that is not true right now. The thing that I'm able to do now in this incredible academic playground in which I now find myself is identify the behavioral, cognitive, and social science that connects issues to what makes people care and how they form their beliefs and behave. This is an incredible resource that I wish I had had available to me back when I was working on issues like the social determinants of health back at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and was never making use of. And this is, for the most part, the most affordable, significant, effective tool that people trying to make change are not using. So, as people who probably, like me, get up in the morning, speed to work, because you think about your issue before your feet hit the floor, you're intensely passionate about the work that you do. Isn't it frustrating that people don't care as much about it as you do? Isn't it frustrating that it's so hard to get people engaged in the data and the facts and all the extraordinary work that you do? Why is it so hard to do that? Why don't people intuitively recognize the value of what it is we're doing? Why don't people adopt behaviors that make them healthier? Why is it that when the Surgeon General in the 1950s told people that there were more than 7,000 published academic studies showing the relationship between morbidity and smoking, that people didn't immediately quit smoking? Why didn't they? We knew. Why didn't we? Why couldn't we just tell people smoking will kill you? And why didn't everybody just quit? We have this idea that people are failing to act because they just don't have enough information. If only they had more information, we could fix everything. Well, this is what we're going to do. We're just going to put a USB port in everybody's brain, and we're going to get flash drives with everything we need them to know, and we're going to upload, and then we're going to fix the world, right? Wouldn't that be so great if we could actually do that? Wouldn't that be the most wonderful thing? And so this is called the information deficit model. And the information deficit model is, this is the definition of it if you love definitions, but that's okay because I have a better way for you to remember it because I'm a teacher and I like to create handy tools for my students to remember complex ideas. So, and I apologize if this is a new idea, that unicorns aren't real and never were, I apologize. Okay, we're good? Okay. I know there are a lot of veterinarians in the room, so I don't think that there's like...
But there's unicorn farms in China. That's true. Okay, not that there are unicorns, but that there are unicorn farms in China.
I will go. I will see these mythical beasts. But we know that these are not actually real beasts that existed, even though they may have figured out a way to engineer them. Is there masking tape involved? So the reality is, if you want people to do something that they're not doing right now, you have to make them care and you have to show them how. That seems so simple, right? Except that that's a whole lot harder than uploading knowledge into their brains, right? How do we actually make people care about something? You are all leaders, and as leaders, we are required to embrace our roles as communicators, and we have to help people care, and we have to show them what it is we want them to do. So I mentioned smoking earlier. I love this ad. This is like, yeah, I want to have a lit cigarette 5 inches from my thigh. That totally makes me feel my level best. That's amazing. But when this ad appeared in the late 1940s, nearly half of Americans smoked. And today in Florida, only 7% of young people smoke. That's an amazing social change. Did that happen because people simply recognize that smoking is bad for you? Or if you think about the amazing advances we've seen in civil rights, there's so much more work to do. However, we've achieved so much. Or if you think about the fact that deaths and accidents associated with drinking and driving have dropped by half since the 1980s. Or the fact that in this country, people can marry the person that they love. Did all of those changes happen because we simply changed as a society, as culture changed, or people recognized what should be that wasn't? No. Every single one of those was designed by communicators who recognized the systems in which they were working and worked to affect a larger change. So when we bring together systems thinking, human-centered design, and strategic communication, we can make profound change. So we have to start with the fundamentals of what make people care and embrace the things that actually make people care and capture their attention. And that starts with figuring out the smallest possible community who is your target and bringing them value. When I first went into this field, I thought about communications like this. We're going to find this super perfect message that everybody's going to love and we're going to push it out. And we are going to adhere relentlessly to our message. But that doesn't work. It doesn't work. We have to find, it's not about what we want to say. It's about finding the thing that others can hear. It's about finding the thing that others want and giving it to them. Sometimes that requires us to lead with, not with our ideology, but with an intense practicality. And that hurts sometimes because we care so much about our issues that we want everybody to know as much about it and care as much about it as we do. But we don't need to require everybody to be an expert in our discipline to do the thing that they're not doing right now. It's really about finding where those values intersect. So I have another example that has nothing whatsoever to do with your discipline, but is the most brilliant example of somebody working, leading, not with ideology, but with practicality in a way that made a profound difference on an issue that nobody thought that they could solve.
Seus olhos vão continuar assistindo o esporte.
Que os seus pulmões continuarão expirando pelo esporte.
Prometo que o seu coração sempre baterá pelo esporte.
Hoje a maior dificuldade que existe no processo de doação é o sim da família.
Eu sou rubro-negro até depois de morrer, irmão. Minha alma é rubro-negra.
Ainda mais que quando eu doar meus órgãos, pô, meu pulmão for pro cara do Náutico, torcedor do Náutico, ele vai respirar o esporte.
A campanha atingiu números impressionantes. 51 mil torcedores se declararam doadores, uma quantidade superior à capacidade da Ilha do Retiro.
A campanha do esporte, eu não tenho dúvida alguma que serviu para que, aumentando a oferta de doadores, a gente conseguisse zerar essa lista, conseguisse realizar o transplante em todos que estavam precisando.
Uma campanha de doação de órgãos lançada pelo esporte está ajudando a salvar a vida de muitos torcedores.
Antes do vídeo eu tinha passado 18 anos de diabetes e 5 anos fazendo hemodiálise. E a visão está melhorando, minha visão está voltando aos pouquinhos. Eu renasci.
Para mim, a gente tem um provável coração para sua mãe. Você pode trazer ela, com certeza. E a Eliane sabia que eu ainda iria poder ter.
I love this. You can see why I would love this so much. And what I love about it is that, yes, it's incredibly inspiring, but it's also super pragmatic, right? Because they could, if they were trying to overcome a cultural taboo against being an organ donor for anybody other than a family member, they could have said, our target audience is everybody in Brazil who has organs, right? And I am not a doctor or a veterinarian. I have no medical training whatsoever, but I am mostly sure that everybody in Brazil has organs, right? Yes, okay. So that could have been their target audience, but they didn't choose that as their target community. They chose the fans of this particular soccer club. How come? Why did they do that? They were a family. They were a super passionate family, right? And if you couldn't be an organ donor for anybody other than a family member, what feels just like family? Your fellow fans. What do we want to do? What is the value that came to people for being organ donors? they achieved a higher level of status among the other fans because they weren't just fans. Oh no, they were immortal fans. So they had a higher level of standing within an existing tribe. So I think that this campaign has a great deal to teach us about how to lead with pragmatism over ideology. Is there any obvious connection between football and organ donation? No, none whatsoever. And what's also super fascinating to me about this is that at the time it must have felt like a sacrifice. I'm sure that they wanted to reach everybody in Brazil with their message, but it wouldn't have worked because it would have been so watered down, it wouldn't have been connected to the thing that they were passionate about. So a lot of times being an effective communicator means that you have to do less with more. And yes, I really did mean to say less with more. Think about how knives work. Knives work because they're sharp. Knives work when the edge of the knife is as narrow as possible. And we have to find that way and then when the knife is super sharp, we're able to put so much more force onto that narrow area and slice through. Strategy is exactly the same way. We have to find the way, the narrowest possible place to apply the most resources. I often hear people say, we don't have enough resources to be strategic. And my response to that is, strategy is making use of the resources that you have. It's about the restraint, not the abundance. And so work within those limitations. I loved watching one of our colleagues here at UF, Lisa Scott works in psychology, and her particular area of research focuses on looking at the books that the infants should be reading at different stages of development. And she really wanted to get this knowledge into the brains of parents, but if she was going to do that, she would have had to wait for somebody developing a curriculum for early childhood education to come across her research and incorporate it into their work. So by the time she published and somebody found it and they turned it into curriculum, that could have been a decade, right? And she's like, no, I need to get it into parents' minds now. So instead of simply publishing her work in an academic journal, she also wrote about it for The Conversation, which is an online publishing platform in which academics write timely news articles. They have a Creative Commons license that makes it possible for their content to appear in countless publications. So she wrote a piece for The Conversation, Parents Magazine picked it up, she got 600,000 reads in a matter of 2 weeks. She found a much more direct way to find a way to get her knowledge into the hearts and minds of people who mattered most. So we think about this in a 4-question framework. And the thing that we start with first is, what is it that you want to happen? What do you want to be true that isn't true right now? And this has to be super tangible and super visual. It can't be people are more aware. It has to be something you can count, something you can see, something that will be noticeably different. Who are you trying to reach with your work? And I think about this as who, in this very literal way, has to start doing something or stop doing something for you to be effective. What do they need to believe? What would they believe that they don't believe right now if they were doing this thing? And it's important to think about it within the context of their beliefs because it has to be something that they could believe. And where is their attention? And this is really about finding the conversations that are already happening and joining those existing conversations rather than trying to get people to come into your own. If anybody went to a cocktail party over the weekend or you're going to a Thanksgiving event this week, nobody is going to walk into the middle of a crowded room and say, hello, everybody. There are a few things that I'd like you to be aware of about my work. Let me start broadcasting these from the middle of the room. Nobody does that, right? That would be awful and annoying and painful for everybody. No. Instead, what do? We scan the room. We look for people who are interesting to us. We sidle up to them. We listen to the conversation, and when we have something of value to contribute, we join in. Strategic communications is exactly the same way. We have to find the existing conversations and join those conversations rather than jumping up and down and trying to get people to pay attention to us. So we worked at this example with some of our friends in engineering, and one of the things that they were trying to do was get temperature sensors that save energy included in every new building in Gainesville. How would we do that? How do we use the 4-question format to do that? Well, who would believe something, who would have to act that isn't acting right now? The Board of County Commissioners, the Utility Advisory Board, and builders of new homes. What would they need to believe about your work? That there would be savings, that there would be environmental value, and other cities are seeing success. Where is their attention? Well, you could speak at their monthly meetings. You could invite the members to visit the college. You could have people come and speak at your meetings, or you could set up meetings with individual members. But when you focus on your target community as narrowly as possible, these forms of interpersonal and much more focused communication can be much more powerful and effective. So, as you think about who your target community is, are you connecting to the thing, not that you care most about, but that they care most about, and couching your conversation in that context? So the next fundamental is the importance of talking in pictures. And we live in this technological age where we have wonderful platforms like Instagram and Facebook Live and all of this technology that helps us do that. But I'm not talking about technology here, and I'm not talking about design. I'm talking about using figural language. In the Center for Public Interest Communications, we have various intellectual crushes, and Steven Pinker is one of them. He talks about how 1/3 of our brains are dedicated to vision. And one of the other things that he writes about in The Sense of Style is that readers are more likely to understand and remember material when it is expressed in concrete language that allows them to form visual images. So how are we using these visual metaphors to help people understand incredibly complex ideas? Another study at Princeton on specific language looked at word pairs. They looked at pairs of sweet and kind, and they looked at a word pair of bitter and mean. Now, based on what I just told you about Steven Pinker saying that we tend to remember language that is associated with imagery and motion, which word between sweet and kind are people more likely to remember specifically? Sweet, you got it. Every word you use matters. Let's try it again. Which one works better, bitter or mean? Bitter. Every single word you use matters. When you use language that connects to experience, that connects to visuals, people remember what you say. When we communicate in abstraction, it floats away. Or if it doesn't connect to something they already know, it floats away. We have to connect to what they already know and use these concrete visual terms. I love the example of Dr. King's speech on the National Mall for communicating abstraction concretely. I want to play for you just a minute of this speech, and I want you to tell me some of the visual terms that he uses, okay?
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, a little boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
We were doing a workshop with, we do a project with, that's funded by Department of State and Department of Defense, where they work with senior military officials from around the world that are specifically taking on human trafficking and terrorism. And they bring them all to Stennis Space Center and talk with them about building support for their ideas. And so we were helping them think about strategic communications plans for those ideas. And we shared this with them. And one man who was from Chad said that, he said, I've never seen this speech before, but if you had asked me to describe freedom before I saw this, I could not have. But he made picture after picture after picture in my mind, and now I can see nothing else. I love that he so beautifully articulated how metaphors create those opportunities to create specificity around abstract ideas. So what were some of the images that you heard in that speech? The oasis, yep. The table. Joining hands. What else? The heat was an especially brilliant one because it was August in Washington, which is actually worse than August in Gainesville. They were feeling the heat of the sun on them, and he translated the suffering of being in that hot heat that day with what they were feeling as part of their lives. Any others? I love when he talks about Governor Wallace with his lips dripping. He doesn't say the Governor Wallace is a monster. He uses the same language that we would use to describe a monster to talk about the governor. And it's so much more powerful because he does that. Here's an example that I absolutely love from a TED Talk by Carrie Fowler, who talks about biodiversity. Let's see if this works. Oh, it didn't work.
Here's some beans, and there are about 35 or 40 different varieties of beans on this picture. Now, imagine each one of these varieties as being distinct from another about the same way as a poodle from a Great Dane. If I wanted to show you a picture of all the dog breeds in the world, and I put 30 or 40 of them on a slide, it would take about 10 slides, because there are about 400 breeds of dogs in the world. But there are about 35 to 40,000 different varieties of beans. So if I were going to show you all the beans in the world, and I had a slide like this, and I switched it every second, it would take up my entire TED Talk, and I wouldn't have to say anything.
So in that super quick example, he creates a very powerful image about the diversity of beans. It took him 20 seconds to do that in a really powerful way that we could easily relate to. And I love the way that Christine Vigener recently, the marine biologist, 2 years ago, she encountered a sea turtle with a plastic straw stuck in its nose, in its nostril, right? And what did she do when she encountered that sea turtle with a plastic straw in its nostril? She videoed it. And what happened next? It went viral. And now you see all of these organizations rethinking the distribution of plastic straws and our dependence on them because of this single, incredibly powerful image. When I was at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and we were trying to help conservative policymakers understand how social factors affect health, one of the things that we discovered in our research was that conservatives tended to see health as a journey. And so we decided that by listening to that metaphor, that we could use that metaphor in all of our communications about the issue. So if we started by our conversations with this audience by talking about the issue in the way that we already thought they were already thinking about it, we found that we were able to keep their attention much longer and keep them engaged in the conversation because we were starting with a metaphor that worked for them. So that was a matter of listening to them and listening to the metaphors they were already using and using that visual for everything we did. It seems strange to have a health report have a picture of a road with houses on it, and yet by adhering relentlessly to this metaphor, we were able to engage former Senator Bill Frist to be one of the chairs of a commission that we established on this, and we were also able to engage Walmart stores in this topic, which they were not previously interested in having this conversation at all. But it started with using a metaphor that meant something to them and working from that metaphor. Now, one of the things that people within our team worried a lot about was that we would lose the choir by shifting to the interests of this other community that wasn't already engaged. We never lost the choir. We never lost the choir. In fact, they were invigorated by the addition of these new voices. So how are you using visual language to help people connect with your ideas? The next thing I want you to think about is how we use emotion and being super strategic and intentional about emotion. I'm really interested in a controversial area of psychology, evolutionary psychology, and looking at how our various emotions may have evolved as adaptive responses to specific problems. And when you think about emotion that way, it allows you to use emotion much more strategically. A lot of times when we're talking about an issue we care a lot about, we kind of go here, right? Like, oh, and we love animals, especially in this room. Like, we really love animals. But I bet you don't like this commercial any more than I do. Am I right? Yeah. Okay, I'll stop it. So we go to these unpleasant emotions when we're trying to get people to care. We go to fear, right? And fear makes us run away if we don't know how to fight. Sadness, if we don't have a way to alleviate the sadness, we just check out. We tend to avoid, I don't need to cite any studies, though I could, from people who are at this university, one of whom did a study in which people were willing to pay $10 not to have to find out whether they had herpes. Right? Terrifying, I know. We don't like to hear negative things. We don't like to hear bad things. And so, and we don't like to feel fear or sadness. So unless we have a really clear path to alleviating it. So we have to find other more pleasant emotions to use if we're trying to get people engaged in something they're not engaged in right now. One of the ones that is underused is awe. Awe creates a warm glow effect. It makes us feel small in a big world, and it creates a willingness to work together to solve a big challenge. I don't know if you've seen this film, some of you may have, but I love this as an example of juxtaposing awe with other emotions and stories as a way of introducing what may be new perspectives.
But at that moment, he wasn't a terrorist, he wasn't an insurgent, he wasn't an Iraqi. He was a scared man.
تقدر تسامحيني ده انا قتلت بيك او خيك وما في قانون حسبني بتسامحيني؟
Inventamos una montaña de consumo superfluo y hay que tirar y vivir comprando y tirando y lo que estamos gastando es tiempo de vida.
And then I met, to me, the love of my life. And her name was Jen. And gosh, it was just like my world changed.
Sumulin na panin mo. Lady Nido.
Has anybody seen that film? It's wonderful, isn't it? It's on YouTube. I strongly encourage you to spend some time watching it over the weekend if you're trying to have some R&R. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should start using your NSF grants for crane shots. That's not what I'm suggesting here, though that would be amazing. But you can certainly do in your writing and in your speaking, you can invoke the kinds of awe and wonder that they do through film. You have wonder available to you in abundance. That's why you followed this path. That's why you chose this field. The wonder that you feel, the passion that you feel when you show that to others, they will feel it too, because we tend to mirror the emotions that we see on others. Another emotion that is underutilized is pride. We do a lot of work with the UN Agency on Refugees, and one of the things that's been really interesting to us is that when we were in Geneva last February, many of the staff people said, I just want people to empathize with how hard it is to leave everything behind and run for your life. And that's a really powerful idea, except that nobody wants to feel that because that's terrifying. And so they check out of the refugee story. And people are checking out of the refugee story because it requires them to feel things that they don't want to feel. It's also true that we are more likely to act out of anticipated pride than anticipated guilt. And so we see this across research and environment. We see it across the humanitarian issues. So if you can help people anticipate feeling proud of doing something rather than feeling guilty for not doing it, you're far more likely to motivate them to act. We also see all the time that humor is intensely underutilized, especially when you have the opportunity to punch up at something that people are afraid of. I love this example.
Just you? I'm here to check your prostate. I am the prostate check. You know the time? Oh, not that time. It's time to check your prostate. Hello? Prostate check. Get your prostate check here.
I think not.
Oh, that's okay. I don't want to get it checked.
Hey, you're in the right position, you know?
I know.
You're nicely bent. I mean, I can do it here, but it might be very unpleasant for you, right? Do you mind if I come in and check your... You're sweating.
I know.
So what are we making fun of here? Are we making fun of cancer? No, cancer is awful. What are we making fun of? The fear of being checked, right? Which, when you can find something to make fun of that is seen as powerful and turn that around and mock it, then you can use humor really effectively in your social change campaigns. But you never want to punch down. You never want to be making fun of a person or something that makes us feel less powerful. David Pravat, who is an engineer and who studies buildings resilience in the face of major weather events, has used emotion really effectively in his talk, in his work. When he talks about his work, he often uses the example of this community in Moore, Oklahoma. And if you look at this lower left-hand corner, you see a community just before a tornado hit in 2012. And now you see that community 5 years later. There's been a wide swath of devastation and those buildings have not been reconstructed. And he says, when he talks about this, he says what's frustrating to him is that the research existed a year before that showed how those buildings could have withstood the tornado had the research been applied. But he'll say that's not even the most frustrating part. He also did a study that was published in 1994 that showed something pretty similar. So what is that? I'm mathing out loud. 16 years? No, 18 years earlier. But here's a study from 1968 showing nearly the same thing, and a study from 100 years before that tornado hit showing the same thing. And he talks about his frustration, saying we have known how to build buildings that could withstand these kinds of events for hundreds of years. We are still not doing it. This means that I have to be an advocate, not for policy, but for the truth. I have to advocate for the truth. And so he steps out of his role as a researcher to think about how he can build apps and other tools that will help people apply this in real time. I love this. He says, if I am not affecting the community with my research, it is not the community that needs to change. I need to change. So, how can you use emotion with intention to get people to engage with your ideas? How can you identify emotions that they are seeking out, emotions that are pleasant rather than unpleasant, as a way of engaging them in something that they might not otherwise be willing to engage with? I'm not telling you that you have to tell happy stories all day long, but if you're not getting traction with sad stories or using fear, finding a way to get people to anticipate pride, bringing the awe and sense of wonder that you feel about your work into your conversations, you might be able to gain traction where you haven't before. The next thing we need to do is make our calls to action actionable, which seems like kind of a duh, except that we see a lot of calls to action that look like this: for more information, or sign our petition, which kind of doesn't really make me feel all that confident that I'm making a difference, right? Our goals and calls to action are not the same. I want nothing more than to end racism on this campus, but I don't know how to walk out of this room and do it. So, how do we give somebody something specific to do that will help them recognize the difference that they can make? Your calls to action need to be concrete and specific. So in one study, people were divided into two groups. One group was told, in 24 hours, go out and help the environment. The other group was told, in the next 24 hours, increase recycling among your friends and family. They came back together. They were asked who, if they were likely to do it again. Who was more likely to do it all again? The second group. They asked them who felt a greater sense of accomplishment. Who felt a greater sense of accomplishment? The second group. So we need to give people specific calls to action that help them understand exactly what it is that we want them to do. People also need to recognize that their action is actually going to help solve the problem. If you ask me to sign a petition, I'll sign it. Yeah, sure, I like you. I'll sign your petition, but I don't really feel like it's going to make much of a difference. And this leads to what Dr. Paul Slovic calls pseudo-inefficacy. If we don't feel that the thing that we're being asked to do makes a difference, we're unlikely to do it. And he talks about this in the context of Mother Teresa, saying, like, when I look at this massive problem, I'm probably not going to do anything. But if you ask me to do something that's going to help one person, I'm highly likely to do that. And the other thing is, people need to know how to do it. I said earlier, if you asked me to end racism on this campus, I would want to do nothing more, but I don't know how. So how do we actually give people something to do that they know how to do? In Denver, they tried to get people to conserve water for decades. For decades. Water is our greatest natural asset. Don't waste it. It didn't work. And so more recently, a very creative campaign by the Denver Water Company got people to take it on in a really actionable way. Watch this and tell me how it meets the criteria for good calls to action that I just gave you.
Look, hey, they're watering again. I love it. Extra water makes me extra awesome. Hey!
So that's a little more my way.
Honestly. Grass is dumb. Water 2 minutes less. It won't notice.
Okay, why does that work? It's super specific, water 2 minutes less. If you tell me to conserve water, I don't really know. Does that mean shower, not shower, take a short shower? What is a short shower? Do I water my lawn? Do I not water? There's a lot of confusion in conserve water. But water 2 minutes less, totally know how to do that. Use only what you need is a brilliant call to action because you have not asked me to make any sacrifices, and yet I am still using less water. It's absolutely brilliant. I love this campaign, so I'm going to show you one more example. I think.
Man, I have had a lot of water.
Me too, man. I've had a lot of water.
Oh, sweet Mary. I've had a little too much.
That certainly looks nothing like Midtown on a Friday. So what is so fantastic about this campaign, of course, is that it worked. And today, the city of Denver uses less water than it did in the 1970s. They successfully reduced their water use by 30% 5 years ahead of their deadline. So when you create those super specific calls to action that don't make people feel guilty, they use pleasant emotions like humor, and they're super specific, people are far more likely to do the thing that you want them to do. If you think about the Montgomery bus boycott and the criteria that I gave you for great calls to action, the women of the Women's Political Caucus who organized the boycott and had been planning it for years before Rosa Parks was arrested knew that the buses were already fragile in terms of ending segregation because they were already partially integrated, unlike restaurants and schools and hotels. Those were completely segregated, but buses, transportation, was already partially integrated, so it presented a weak spot in the Jim Crow system. And so Joanne Robinson, who was the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott, recognized that and knew that she just had to wait for the right moment for the right person to be arrested for not giving up her seat. The day that Rosa Parks was arrested, December 1st, she got a call from Rosa Parks' lawyer, Fred Gray, who said, "I believe our moment may have come." Joanne Robinson was a professor at Alabama State College. She went back to her university, she typed up a flyer, and because she had planned this for so long, she was like a Paul Revere of the civil rights movement, and she handed out those flyers to exactly everybody who could get them in the hands of every black bus rider in Montgomery. They were in their hands by 10 a.m. Friday morning. And, also, Fred Gray, in that conversation with Joanne Robinson, said, "We're going to need somebody to lead this movement. Do you have any ideas?" And she said, "I have this pastor who can change people's hearts with his words. Perhaps he would be a good choice." So the next Monday, it was rainy. They were afraid that nobody would adhere to the boycott, and everybody did. And that evening, the riders voted to sustain the boycott until segregation on public transportation was ended. It took them more than a year of walking and forming informal taxi services, but they ultimately succeeded. And they did that because their call to action was crystal clear, and it met all of these criteria. Don't ride the bus. I know how to do it. I believe it will make a difference, and it is specific enough that I can see how it will create the bigger change that I'm working toward. So we need to find those really specific calls to action because they're incredibly powerful. So what are you asking people to do that is actually going to make a difference? How are we doing time-wise? I'm okay? Okay, good. So our next one is building curiosity. And when I think a lot about curiosity, I'm still exploring the research around this with my colleagues in the center, but I thought that we were most curious about the things that we know least about. But interestingly, counterintuitively, if we were going to go around this room and ask each of you what you're most curious about, it would be something that you know most about, not what you know least about. And understanding that changes how we think about nurturing other people's curiosity. So if we're most curious about the things that we know most about, then we have to help people understand the thing that we're trying to engage them in. One of the things that happens all the time is that, I mentioned this earlier, we try to make people experts in our area, and they don't need to be. We can just create a scaffold. We can attach to the things that they already know. I moved to Florida 8 years ago, and it's funny because I ran across this example later in a book that I love. But I moved here, and my family was like, "We are new to Florida. We will do what people in Florida do. We will go citrus picking." And they were like, "You're here. What do you want to pick? Do you want to pick tangerines, kumquats, pomelos?" And I was like, "Pomelo? What is this dark magic?" And they were like, "Well, you know, it's like big and sort of bitter and pink." And they're like, "It's like an oversized grapefruit." And I was like, "Of course, show me the way to the pomelos. I can't wait to try them." I was more curious about them when they were attached to something that I already understood. We're like that with everything. So as you try to help people understand your work, think about the things that they already know and are familiar with and attach to that. It's also true, and we learned this tip from some of the producers at Science Friday, that one of our habits as people who work in a specific field is when we have a specific acronym or scientific term that's associated with our work, we tend to define that term and then keep using it. Of course we can do that, right? We've defined it. They should understand the definition. When you do that, you turn your conversation into a vocabulary test where your poor audience is desperately trying to recollect what that acronym stood for. So what you need to do instead of defining things is, yes, define them, but instead of using the acronym or the definition or the term over and over again, keep speaking in definitions. Talk in definitions. It will take more time, but you'll result in far greater understanding. And people will be able to ask better questions and explore their own curiosity. So how are you building your community's knowledge to nurture your curiosity and speaking in definitions? So the last fundamental is to tell stories. And I'm really passionate about the science behind great stories. I'm a big fan of Andy Goodman. He writes a terrific newsletter called Free Range Thinking. And he says, stories are the fundamental unit of human communication. In other words, if we're not telling stories, we're not communicating. I heard this amazing, I was in the car for 10 minutes over the weekend, and I heard a psychiatrist, I was listening to, anybody listening to NPR, did you catch this? Because I would love to know what it was. He said, depression is a disease of narrative, that it's about the stories that we tell ourselves about our life experience. We are constantly building our life experience into a narrative. We are constantly looking to make connections. And so if we are not communicating in the form of story, our listeners are creating a story for themselves. That story may be inaccurate. So if you don't give them a story, they're going to make one up that might not be accurate. It's also true that every social movement starts with a story. When you think about it, it's hard to imagine a social movement that's been powerful that didn't start with one story or many stories. It is, as change makers, the most powerful tool we have. If you saw the movie Get Out, yeah? Did it capture our attention? Oh yeah, yeah. Every second we're on the edge of our seat waiting to know what happened next. There's nothing more powerful than the desire to know what happens next. It's also true that stories can make what's new familiar. Christopher Booker wrote a book, The 7 Basic Plots, in which he posits that in all of the different stories that we tell, there are only 7 universal plots. They are rags to riches, the quest, comedy, tragedy, rebirth. And you can probably think of stories. Christmas is coming, so The Grinch is a fantastic rebirth story, right? So by using these familiar plot structures to introduce new ideas, we make something that's new familiar because we're using a plot structure that people already know and understand. We're putting it in the context of something that they're already comfortable with. But it's also a way, if you tweak your plot structure or use a different plot structure to tell a familiar story, you can make the familiar new. So one of the things that the UN Agency on Refugees is doing is looking for new kinds of narratives to tell. For a long time, humanitarian sector was trying to rewrite the narrative around refugees being dangerous by saying these are people who need our help, they need our support, they need our love, we need to open ourselves to them, which was a really great and powerful message, except that created a new master narrative in which refugees were then seen as a burden. And so what the UN Agency on Refugees is now experimenting with is telling more stories about how refugees bring strengths and talents and new cultures and new abilities to communities and make the communities that they join even better as a way of rewriting the master narrative about what it means to be a refugee. Stories help us understand ideas that are abstract and complex. Did anybody see the movie Hidden Figures? It's a fantastic story about what it must have felt like to experience that kind of racism and bias in the workplace and how agonizing it must have been. We understand that in a way that we could read countless sociological abstracts on the topic and never understand it and feel it in the same way that we do after having seen that movie. When we hear stories, we are more likely to empathize with the protagonist and take their perspective. So when you tell really compelling stories about individuals, even your own story, your own journey, people are much more likely to empathize and connect with you. It's also true that when we hear from people who are particularly affected by a challenge, we see them as being more authentic and trustworthy. And you can see this in action if you think about what's happening with Me Too and the incredible support that the Parkland students are getting. One of the things that we say often in the Center for Public Interest Communications is the most affected are the most effective. So sometimes our job as strategists is to get out of the way and make space for people who have been deeply affected by a challenge to tell their own stories and to share their own experience. When we hear a compelling story, we are far less likely to counter-argue, which is that silent inner monologue that we have when we're disagreeing with somebody as we listen to them. What makes great stories? Well, because we're in a college of journalism at a research university, does anybody read Brain Pickings by Maria Popova? It's this great, it's so wonderful, I love it. It comes out every Sunday morning like a gift at 6:30 a.m. and she reviews philosophy and great literature and books that are out of print, and with her beautiful writing shares the insights from them. So one day she shared this insight from Jerome Bruner, who's an educational psychologist, and he said, you know, we know stories work, but we don't know enough about how to make them better. So I was so fascinated by this idea that I went to work on Monday and I was like, guys, let's see if this is true. Let's find everybody who's researching story and invite them over and have a conversation with them. And we presented this idea to the dean, and she was like, okay, if you want, if you have funding. So we had a little bit of money left from a night grant, and we invited people who study story all over the world from a variety of academic disciplines to come over to the college and sit with us for a day and a half in small group conversations that were facilitated by professional storytellers from NPR and Fusion. And we recorded those conversations and distilled them into a set of principles about what makes one story more compelling, inspiring, and memorable than another. One of the things that was particularly interesting to us was that the space that's in a story that's empty is what makes it powerful. And so when we tell stories in which we let the audience do some of the work, when we don't give them all of the details up front, but we force them to put things together for themselves, they're far more engaging. This is why we love mystery novels, right? This is why we're captivated by crime stories, right? Because we're imagining what must have happened. We're imagining how all of this is going to turn out. And so we also had to create room for the listener or the audience to connect their own experience. So if I were trying to tell a story in which I wanted you to connect your own experience, I might use the term school, recognizing that how you see school might be different from how you see school. So if we both see school and have our own image in our mind, it may not matter to me that those are totally different, unless I were trying to rewrite an existing bias you had about schools. And in that case, I might describe school in extensive detail to help rewrite the picture that's in your head. So one of the things that we can do in stories is be super strategic and deliberate about where we use empty space and full space as we're trying to rewrite how people see an issue they think they already understand. So we saw this at work in the story of Alan Kurdi, whose tiny body washed ashore in Greece. And I look at this picture, and we have all seen this picture so many times, and it hurts so much to look at this picture. One of the things that strikes me about why this picture is so painful is because of the universality of the way he is dressed and the fact that we don't see his face. We see a child we love in his experience. It is very easy for us to imagine a child we care about in his tiny body. And as a result, we saw a massive increase in donations to alleviate the Syrian crisis. So when people see themselves in stories, they connect to it in new ways. The other thing is that if you're going to tell stories about your work, they have to be good stories. They can't be parables because nobody stays up all night reading Aesop's fables. They have to be great stories. And what makes a great story is unexpected elements. One of the people who participated in that summit I mentioned was somebody who works with the horror film industry to make horror films scarier. I'm like, thanks, I guess. I don't know. I'm not really a fan of horror. Like, life is hard enough. But he said that we have to just keep our audience at the edge of expectation. We have to keep them just comfortable enough. And this has a counterpart on the comedy side. It's called the benign violation theory. If Kathy were to come up here and throw a banana at me, you would be like, that's hilarious, as long as I got up immediately and wiped the banana off my head. But if it knocked me out and I was permanently scarred, it wouldn't be as funny because it would be a benign violation if I'm fine. If I actually get hurt, not funny. So we see it in comedy and we see it in horror. And I think about it, I really struggled with how to explain this, but I came across this clip from my favorite TED Talk ever. And this clip has nothing to do with communications and every single thing to do with communications. And I'm going to show it to you, and you can tell me what this clip teaches us about great stories.
So let's see what's really going on here. We have a B. This is a B. The next note is a C. And the job of the C is to make the B sad. And it does, doesn't it? Composers know that. If they want sad music, they just play those two notes. But basically, it's just a B with four sads. Now it goes down to A, and now to G, and then to F. So we have B, A, G, F. And if we have B, A, G, F, what do we expect next? Oh, that might have been a fluke. Let's try it again. Ooh, the TED choir. And you notice nobody is tone deaf. Is that right? Nobody's, every village in Bangladesh and every hamlet in China, everybody knows. Da, 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 da. Everybody knows who's expecting that E. Now, Chopin didn't want to reach the E there because what will have happened? It'll be over, like Hamlet. You remember Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 3, he finds out that his uncle killed his father. You remember he keeps on going up to his uncle and almost killing him. And then he backs away, and then he goes up to him again and almost kills him. And the critics, all of whom sitting in the back row there, they have to have an opinion. So they say, Hamlet is a procrastinator. Or they say, Hamlet has an Oedipus complex. No, otherwise the play would be over, stupid. That's why Shakespeare puts all that stuff in Hamlet, Ophelia going mad and the play within the play and Yorick's skull and the gravediggers. That's in order to delay until Act 5 he can kill him. It's the same with the Chopin. He's just about to reach the E and he says, oops, better go back up and do it again. So he does it again. Now he gets excited. That's excitement, you don't have to worry about it. Now he gets to F sharp and finally he goes down to E. But it's the wrong chord. Because the chord he's looking for is this one. Right? And instead he does. Now we call that a deceptive cadence. Because it deceives us. I always tell my students, if you have a deceptive cadence, be sure to raise your eyebrows, then everybody will know. All right. So he gets to E, but it's the wrong chord. Now he tries E again. That chord doesn't work. Now he tries E again. That chord doesn't work. Now he tries E again. That doesn't work. And then finally, there was the gentleman in the front row. He went, like that.
So, we have to find our deceptive cadences in stories. And you may be like, I don't have that. I don't have a deceptive cadence in the story. But sometimes finding that moment of surprise or creating that moment of surprise is just telling the story differently than you have before, or taking the perspective of somebody whose perspective isn't usually given. So, for example, I told you the story earlier of the Montgomery bus boycott. Had you heard Joanne Robinson's name before? Did you know that Dr. King wasn't the leader and that he was actually pushed forward by this woman whose name you'd never heard? That was a deceptive cadence in the story. It was true, but it was a surprise because that's not the story as we have always heard it, right? So hearing the story from a different perspective, hearing it from a new character, or holding back and sharing a detail at a different moment than we might otherwise can create those moments of surprise, can keep us wondering what happens next. So as you tell stories, really think about that structure and where you can create moments of surprise. One of the things that we were at the Gates Foundation talking about stories, and somebody asked us, and it was like, well, how do you know when you've told a story too many times? And we're like, say more. What do you mean by that? And he said, well, you know, like, we've been talking about U.S. international aid for decades, but, you know, people continue to overestimate the amount that we give, and, you know, when do we need to stop telling that story? And I was like, that's not a story, that's a message. It doesn't deliver any of the cognitive benefits of story. And yet, a lot of times, we use story as a proxy term for messages, or we use a vignette. We create a single character and share the experience of a single character. But if you're not following the Gustav Freytag's arc, you are not telling a story. So you may remember this from your 10th grade lit class. This is, many of my students in my classes elect to get this as a tattoo, because if it's a tattoo, you're not cheating. But if your story doesn't include an exposition, Harry Potter is living with this family that he doesn't like very much. Inciting incident, he gets a letter. Rising action, he gets thousands of letters. Climax, he's fighting Voldemort in the basement of Hogwarts. Falling action, he defeats him and goes on to continue to save Hogwarts for another school year. Denouement, he's riding home on the train. If we don't have that moment where Harry Potter is fighting Voldemort, if we don't have a moment in the story where the shit hits the fan, you don't have a story. If you don't have a moment when you don't know how the protagonist is going to escape from the problem in which they solve themselves, you are not telling a story. Now, the challenge with that, of course, is that the climax is the part where we are most vulnerable, right? It is the part of the story where things are really going wrong. It can be really hard to tell stories that follow the narrative arc because the things that are most interesting to our audience may often be the things we're most afraid that they're going to find out. And yet, that's what makes for great storytelling. And we really have to adhere to this arc if we're going to get the cognitive benefits that are associated with inspiration and memory. So here are some prompts for stories that you can tell about your work. What's a major research breakthrough that you or someone in the field had that can serve as a success story? Have you or someone else learned from failure? Failure is part of the nature of this work, right? It's sort of like structured failure. What are some of the stories that you tell about people in your field that have either overcome challenges or made a difference? How will the world be different because of your research or your work? Why did you choose this path? Or what are the stories that you tell about the origins of your discipline? These are all great stories that you can use to inspire others, to help build understanding, and to help people connect and build curiosity. So how are you telling stories? Are you using stories that are actually stories? And are you using the full and empty spaces to connect with others and overwrite bias? So we've got time for questions. These are some of my favorite resources. The book New Power by Henry Timms and Jeremy Hyman's is the best book I have read about strategic communications in 10 years. They draw on examples as disparate as ISIS and Starbucks and Nike and the Me Too movement. It is a fantastic book. It is so well worth your time and energy. Futurity.org is just a fantastic place to find new research on some of the research coming out of psychology and sociology that can be really helpful in this area. We are constantly publishing stuff at frank.jou.ufl.edu. We also, I told you about that conversation that we had with the 30 scientists who study stories. We wrote all of that up into 7 principles, and you can get it at scienceofstories.org. My email address is acristiano. My colleague Annie Neiman, who is our research director, is Annie@JOU, and Annie and I are constantly tweeting great examples of stories that we think do this work really well, or compelling new research that we think is worth paying attention to if you're trying to make a difference in this space. So I don't know how we're doing for time. Do we have time for a few questions? We have 10 minutes? Great. Yes.
Within the research that they're doing?
We actually have a program that we've developed. It's called the Strategic Leadership Academy. It's a program for researchers and scholars and leaders on campus. It meets 8 times a year, once a month, and we're actually accepting applications now. But we go into the principles of storytelling, using all of this. We do sessions on systems thinking, on human-centered design, how to do TED-style talks, how to use social media to build your own influence. So it's a really deep dive.
I was going to ask, do you like Science Friday on NPR? Is that a good model? Oh, you don't like it?
No, I love it. I love Science Friday. I love Science Friday. And no, I'm sad because they were in Tampa this weekend, and I actually had tickets to see the production in Tampa, and I missed it. So I'm actually cringing because I'm so sad about it and trying not to cry that I missed it. Yeah, I'm a big fan. And in fact, Danielle Dana, who's their executive producer, is going to come to a conference that we organize in February called Frank and speak.
What is Science Friday, for those who don't know?
So Science Friday is this fantastic program. It's on here on our NPR station. It airs on Friday afternoons. They bring in scientists to talk about their work and to tell the stories behind their discoveries. It's hosted by Ira Flato, who's just a fantastic interviewer, but the producers are really extraordinary at helping to prep the scientists as well. There's also a podcast, so if you don't get to listen to it in real time, you can listen to the podcast.
That was very enjoyable indeed.
Thank you.
I anticipate that you think about the future. Where do you think we'll be in 10 years' time in terms of social media, traditional media?
I think that if you understand how brains work, that you can adapt and be far more resilient regardless of the communications environment in which you find yourself. So if you are internalizing these rules that I shared with you, you can successfully communicate regardless of the communications environment in which you find yourself, whether you're speaking one-on-one and trying to get a family member to regularly unload the dishwasher, or whether you are trying to get people engaged in the most important issues that we're facing right now as a society. And if you look at things like climate change, where communications for a long time failed by making, when you think about the way that we sort of historically communicated about climate change, it was that iconic image of the polar bear on the ice cap, right? We need to save our planet. But you've seen the sector evolve, and now we're talking about how climate change is affecting us in our lives, in our daily existence, and the fact that I've also seen this subtle shift in messaging that we're not trying to save the planet because the planet is intensely resilient. We're trying to save human lives. And that's been a really interesting shift in making the message around climate change far more relevant and immediate than it was historically.
Thank you. It was a fascinating, comprehensive, rich, and inspiring presentation. I just wanted to ask you how much a lot of the pitch and the plea that you have is for what is supposed to be the average person. Like, we are all different, right? And I mean, you mentioned how, to some extent, we are similar in the way we latch on things. But for instance, I'm more of a, maybe I'm in the minority. I'm not necessarily captured by concrete ideas, but I'm attracted to abstracts. And maybe a lot of academics are. So maybe we're a minority, but we have to communicate to the majority. So we like abstractions. Those who have done PhDs and things probably are, attracted to things and not the majority are attracted to. But we have to communicate to people that may differ from us. And so to what extent heterogeneity of people matter to what you say, or you try to communicate the average person, the average winning form? I don't know if I make sense, but sometimes when I lecture, I have to think of lecture to people that are different from me, more than what I would be interested in. Yeah.
So I think one of the things that is a real challenge as we think about communicating science is that we think about science communication or research communication as the transfer of knowledge from experts to non-experts, right? And so if you think about, like, you are attracted to abstraction. So if I start talking about string theory, are you going to be like, yes, of course, I need to learn everything about string theory? No, that has nothing to do with your discipline. You're not at all interested in string theory. So if I were trying to get you to be interested in string theory, I might talk about why it's even called string theory and where that term came from and some of the people behind it and why it matters to you, right? So yes, you are attracted to abstraction. You have spent your entire career learning to communicate abstractly and to think abstractly. It's one of the hallmarks of higher levels of learning. But you don't think abstractly about everything. You think abstractly about your level of expertise. So if you're trying to invite somebody else in, we have to connect to our experience. We also have to acknowledge that the world is not divided into experts and non-experts. I am not a physicist. I work in the College of Journalism. However, I do know that if you put a McDonald's eggnog shake on the console of my car and I brake suddenly and there are quizzes from my students sitting next to it, I may spend the next 3 days trying to figure out how to separate the quizzes that are stuck together. I am not a physicist, but I do have direct experience of inertia. And so recognizing that while people may not have your level of expertise, they have experienced it in their own way and they are experts in their own experience. And so connecting with what they are expert in their personal experience is going to create an opportunity for you to pull them into what you are doing.
So
we have a question here, and then we'll choose.
She can go. Well, I'm a woman. Let me, this is cavalry, no? Yeah, no. This is nice to be kind to women. And I forgot what I was going to say. No, I haven't. I find this approach towards empathy and how you engage with people and how you make them resonate extremely interesting. And of course, it's one of the keys of communication. But I would like to challenge you on instead people who are engaging by actually being rude and provocative to others, towards others. So there is, in Italy actually, there's a virologist who has started, against the no-vax movement. You can be polite again, and say things that politely, or you can say, you guys are a bunch of idiots. Okay.
That always works.
Exactly. No, and that's what I'm saying. So here we are talking about how we have to engage with people and make them be on our same wavelength to get the message across. And you see instead people who, it doesn't really matter what they say, but they manage this communication and engagement exactly in the opposite way. And so it's like people who are kept together through love or through hate. It's the same thing. It's a bond. And I was just wondering whether you wanted to comment on how effective that can be.
Yeah, it's a super hard question. Thank you. I think that that's where it's really important to go back to doing less with more, and to get really obsessed with the group of people who need to do something different. And I might consider arguing that that virologist who's anti-vaccination isn't really, he's a distraction for you, because he's
pro-vaccination.
Oh, he's pro.
Against the no-vax, but he tells the no-vax, you're a bunch of idiots.
Ah, I see.
You see, so it's the
I
other
see.
way around. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's very successful, much better than anybody else writing, writing the science.
Yeah, successful in so his message is not helpful.
It's rude. And I know what I'm saying and you don't. A little bit like Trump. I'm sorry, but it's more or less the same type of communication. Shut up. I know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like this when I spend time with my father-in-law. And what I do when I'm talking with my father-in-law is I talk with him about the things that he cares about. I share with him stories that are from my own experience and can usually get him to settle down. Now, there are two different ways to think about people like that. One is that it doesn't actually matter very much whether my father-in-law sees the value of my work, because he's not my target audience, right? He's not somebody who can do me much harm or much good. So I can focus instead on the people whose perspective I'm trying to change and put all of my energy there. It seems that often when people are doing things that are harmful, they can be massive distractions. And if you focus instead on finding the group of people where you can make a difference, that you can spend your own time far more effectively and also have a lower blood pressure. So I spend as little time with my father-in-law. Can be a generous man, but I don't try to spend a lot of time with him because he elevates my blood pressure, and he's not my target audience except on the holidays.
So I am an assistant professor at the university with a new position that's never existed before. And of course, I have all sorts of challenges with bringing folks on board with what I'm doing and why it's important. And science communication is a great tool for that, but it's also a really strong trap for me because it's sort of the way that I prefer to communicate with my audiences, but isn't necessarily the way that we communicate formally in science. Mm-hmm. And so my question is, the discussion and the points that you make as far as storytelling, how can that be useful to scholarly articles or extension publications, those formal styles of writing that may or may not include those sorts of stories, and where the balance might be for us who would like to work with science communication or present ourselves as science communicators, but have responsibilities to our job or our communities that are aside from that.
Yeah. I thank you for thinking about that. There's research that suggests that scholarly articles that are written in using the narrative arc are more cited than those that aren't. There is also research that suggests that grant proposals that invoke the narrative arc are more likely to be funded than those that are not. It is the best tool that we have. You may use slightly different language in some of those different settings, but stories are still the most powerful tool that we have. And so I would not necessarily shy away from them because you feel the pressure. I recognize that we are living in a moment where science is under siege, where the institution, the ivory tower, is being painted as elitist and out of touch. And I think we have to possibly acknowledge that we are to blame, and that the way that we reinforce communicating with one another and with our sector and with the world reinforces all of the worst things that people believe about us. And so if we want others to care about our work, we have to demonstrate that we care about it too, and not be an advocate. I'm not suggesting that you all become activist scholars. I'm suggesting that we do have to be better advocates for truth, tell better stories, and talk about our work in a way that is compelling and accessible, and move beyond our peers in inviting people in. So I greatly appreciate the work that you're doing, and I would say rock on. Keep doing it. Keep being a badass.
All right, so we've gone a little bit over time, so I'm going to ask maybe if we have additional questions, we carry them into the coffee hour that's coming up. Were there any?
Give her a clap.
Well,
thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
were there any closing comments or any kind of logistical issues we need to address? Saskia, you're going to be leading our coffee hour, which is going to start in that room next door.
Okay, can I say something?
Yes.
Because it seems a bit weird just to say, okay, bye-bye, see you next time. Okay, so bye-bye, see you next time. No, okay, so thank you for those of you who are here, and we very much look forward to the next session, which is going to be in a smaller room, and it's going to be trying to distill some of the ideas that we discussed today, and that we and actually put them into context and find maybe some little pathways to implement some of the ideas or some of the concepts that we worked out this morning. I think that one of the most important things that emerged from today is that there are a lot of synergies that can come out of groups like these, and I am very happy to have facilitated this synergy, and I think this synergy wouldn't have happened if all of you didn't turn up, and if a lot of you weren't so enthusiastic about putting this together. So my personal thanks go to Saskia Hendricks, who's been under a lot of pressure with her reporting and all the rest, and she's put up with us. Of course, to Bola for presenting his work, and to Diane Rowland, who is not here, and Ricky Telg from Agronomy and Agroecology. Sorry, Zach Brim. Ricky Telg is still here? He had to go, okay. And so really thank you. And of course, thank you to the Center for African Studies for working on this and understanding how we can relate better even if we work in different fields. I would like to thank the One Health team and Nicolas, the Colombian student who gave his first talk here at UF. So congratulations, Nicolas. Thank you to the team. And of course, thank you to Jim Harper and to the Livestock Innovation Lab team. And thanks again, Ann Cristiano, for a wonderful talk that illuminated us on several ways that maybe we can move forward 1 millimeter at a time. Thank you very much.
And just as a closing note, we have been recording these sessions, so you can contact us at the Livestock Lab if you're interested in receiving those and knowing when those are available. Okay, but the conversation does continue now. We thank all of you who have come today and contributed and listened and participated, and we hope to continue this beyond today as well. Thanks.